Detective Evelyn Reed moved through the city's crime scenes like a priestess administering last rites to the forgotten. Her latest parish was a high-rise apartment, sterile and silent, where the body of a renowned concert pianist lay on a silk rug. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, just a single, impossible wound. Both of his hands had been removed at the wrist with a precision that defied violence. They were simply gone, the cuts so clean and bloodless they looked like the work of a phantom surgeon. It was the third such case in a month, a string of bizarre, ritualistic mutilations that left the city's police force grasping at shadows, each victim chosen for their excellence in a particular field. The pattern was as grotesque as it was baffling. The first victim, an Olympic sprinter, was found missing his legs from the knee down. The second, a celebrated painter, had her eyes taken. Now, the pianist, without his hands. The victims were unconnected by life, but they were being systematically connected in death, their most accomplished parts harvested like prize-winning fruits. Evelyn felt she wasn't hunting a killer, but a collector of human talent, a connoisseur of flesh, who was assembling a masterpiece from the city's most gifted citizens. The crimes were not acts of passion, they were acquisitions, each one a deliberate, calculated, and terrifyingly intimate theft of human potential. Her investigation led her into the esoteric underbelly of the city, a world of forgotten beliefs and whispered heresies. It was there she first heard of the sodality of the form, a cult that preached a terrifyingly literal theology. The scriptures, which Evelyn found in a dusty, back-alley bookstore, spoke of a primordial deity, a being of perfect form, who had been shattered at the dawn of time. Its divine fragments, they believed, were scattered throughout humanity, manifesting as exceptional talent or physical perfection. They saw it as their sacred duty, not to worship this god, but to rebuild it, to physically reassemble its body from the best parts humanity had to offer. The sodality was a ghost, with no public records or known members, but its influence was a poison seeping into the city's cracks. Evelyn discovered that all the victims had, in the months before their deaths, been approached by a charismatic man who spoke of their talent not as a gift, but as a divine echo. He had offered them a chance for their abilities to become part of something eternal, a legacy beyond fame or memory. They had all dismissed him as a harmless eccentric, never realizing they were being scouted, their bodies appraised for their worthiness as building materials for a god. The trail of breadcrumbs, composed of whispered rumors and arcane symbols left at the scenes, led Evelyn to a defunct medical university on the city's neglected south side. The building was a monument to decay, its grand anatomy theater left to rot for half a century. As she pushed open the heavy oak doors, the air hit her like a physical blow, a cloying, chemical stench of formaldehyde and something else, something metallic and vaguely organic, the smell of a butcher shop that had consecrated as a church. She drew her weapon, the click of the safety echoing in the cavernous, silent space, and knew she had found the cult's temple. The theater was arranged not for lectures, but for worship. The tiered seating was filled with silent, robed figures, their faces hidden in the deep shadows of their cowls. They were not watching her. However, their gaze was fixed on the center of the room, where a massive, marble dissection table served as a gruesome altar. On the altar, illuminated by a single, stark spotlight from above, was the cult's work in progress. It was a towering, half-finished effigy, a grotesque collage of human limbs and tissue stitched, bolted, and fused together into a vaguely humanoid shape. It was a nightmare of mismatched anatomy, a god being built from the dead. She could see the sprinter's powerful legs, the painter's delicate arms ending in stumps where the hands should be, and a torso formed from the sculpted muscles of a bodybuilder who had vanished a year prior. Various organs floated in preservative jars on near tables, labeled and waiting for implantation. This was not just murder, it was a holy act of engineering, a biological construction project of the most blasphemous kind. The robed figures began to hum. A low, monotonous chant vibrated through the floor, a hymn to the abomination they were creating on the altar. From the shadows emerged the cult's high priest, a man whose face Evelyn recognized from witness descriptions. He was Dr. Alistair Finch, a brilliant surgeon who had disappeared from the medical community years ago after a crisis of faith. Moved with a surgeon's grace, his hands clasped before him as if in prayer. His eyes held not the fire of a madman, but the serene, unwavering conviction of a true believer. "You have come to witness the resurrection, detective," he said, his voice calm and resonant. "You see butchery. I see the painstaking work of reuniting the divine with itself. These are not victims. They are contributors. They are the blessed few who will form the vessel of God." Finch explained his philosophy with a terrifying, gentle logic. He believed humanity was a disease, a chaotic swarm of flawed, imperfect beings. The only meaning to be found was in sacrificing one's own fleeting, individual perfection for the sake of a greater, divine whole. "The pianist's hands did not die," Finch explained, gesturing towards a chilled container on a nearby table. "They have simply been returned to their rightful owner. They will slay a symphony that will shake the foundations of heaven itself. Once they are joined to the vessel." He saw himself not as a killer, but as a divine artisan, and his victims were his sacred materials. He led her closer to the altar, his pride overriding any sense of caution. "It is almost complete," he whispered, his eyes gleaming. "The legs to carry his word, the eyes to see all of creation, the hands to shape the world anew. All that is missing is the heart. The vessel requires a heart that is strong, resolute, and unburdened by doubt. A heart that has known darkness but has never succumbed to it." His gaze fell upon Evelyn, and his serene expression was tinged with a predatory excitement. "Your heart, detective. It is the final, perfect piece. You will be the beat that awakens God." The robed figures began to move, closing in on her, their silent forms emerging from the tiered seats like specters. They were armed with surgical tools and heavy restraints. Evelyn backed away, her gun trained on Finch. "This madness," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Finch simply smiled. "Madness is believing your small, individual life has any meaning," he replied. "Salvation is letting go of the self. We will not harm you. We will elevate you. Your sacrifice will complete our work and bring paradise to this broken world." The fight was a desperate, claustrophobic struggle. The cultists moved with a silent, coordinated purpose, their numbers overwhelming. Evelyn fired her weapon, the shots deafening in the enclosed theater, but for every one that fell, two more took their place. She was being herded, pushed back towards the marble altar where the monstrous, unfinished god lay waiting for its final component. The air was thick with the smell of ozone from the gunshots and the ever-present, cloying scent of formaldehyde. It was a battle for her life, and for her very soul, in the shadow of a deity made of stolen flesh. She was cornered against the altar, a cultist grabbing her arm. With a desperate surge of strength, she shoved him away, sending him stumbling into a tall, precarious rack of electrical equipment wired to the vessel. The rack teetered and then crashed down onto the altar, showering the monstrous form with sparks. A massive electrical current surged through the stitched-together flesh. The lights in the theater flickered and died, plunging the room into near darkness, illuminated only by the frantic, blue-white flashes of arcing electricity from the fallen equipment. A sound, deep and guttural, echoed through the darkness, a low, wet moan that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the building. It was a sound of something vast and ancient stirring from a long slumber. The electrical flashes illuminated the scene in horrifying, stroboscopic detail. The composite figure on the altar was moving. A leg, built from the muscles of a dead athlete, twitched and kicked. A hand, once belonging to a master painter, clenched into a fist. The cultists fell to their knees, their chanting turning to cries of ecstatic worship. Their god was awakening. Evelyn didn't wait to see more. She scrambled through the darkness, guided by the dim light of the exit sign, and fled the theater. She ran into the cold night air, the sounds of her own ragged breaths mingling with the distant, triumphant cries of the cultists. She had escaped, but she had not won. The case would be closed, the building condemned, but she knew the truth. The sodality of the form was still out there, and their god, a monstrous thing of stolen parts and stitched-together flesh, was now stirring. It was incomplete, it was wounded, but it was alive, and it was still waiting, patiently, for a righteous heart to make it whole. The Deaver house was a local legend, a place sold for a song because its walls were stained with a history no one wanted. Remember, for the Miller family, however, it was a dream come true, a grand Victorian skeleton they could flesh out with their own lives. As they unpacked the first boxes, David Miller saw only high ceilings and sunlit rooms. His wife, Sarah, however, felt an immediate, inexplicable chill. It was a profound, lingeringness, a cold spot in the very soul of the house that the bright, hopeful sunlight could not seem to touch, an echo of a tragedy she knew nothing about. Their two children, Leo and Maya, adapted in their own ways. Maya, only 7, found an imaginary friend she called Lily, a name that made the local real estate agent flinch when Sarah mentioned it later. Leo, quiet teenager, who lived mostly in the digital world of video games, became withdrawn in a different way. He started exploring the house's dusty corners, the attic and the cellar, places his parents had yet to venture. He claimed the house a voice, a low, constant whisper just beneath the threshold of hearing, like a conversation in a distant, forgotten room that you could feel more than you could actually hear. The first changes were subtle, easily dismissed as the quirks of settling into a new home. A photograph would be turned to face the wall. A music box in Maya's room would play a tinny, unfamiliar tune on its own. But then the habits began to shift. David, a man who prided himself on his healthy lifestyle, found an old, half-empty bottle of expensive whiskey in a forgotten cabinet and began drinking it nightly. He developed a sudden, obsessive fascination with the grandfather clock in the hall, spending hours tinkering with its gears, though he had never shown an ounce of mechanical interest before in his life. Leo's transformation was the most alarming. His video games lay untouched, gathering dust. He had taken up a new hobby, whittling. He would sit for hours on the porch, a small, sharp knife in his hand, carving bird-like figures from scraps of wood. His expression, once placid and distant, was now often a mask of simmering, unfocused anger. When Sarah asked where he had learned to carve, he simply shrugged, said, "The house taught me." His hands, once soft from a keyboard, were becoming calloused and rough, the hands of someone else, from another time. Sarah felt as though she were the only one awake in a house full of sleepwalkers. She started researching the property's history, a task the realtor had conveniently glossed over. The truth was a single, brutal headline from a decade prior: Deaver family lost in apparent murder-suicide. The article detailed how the father, a heavy drinker and clock enthusiast named Thomas Deaver, had murdered his wife and 2 children before taking his own life. The son, it mentioned in a chilling note, had been a gifted woodcarver. The daughter's name, of course, had been Lily. The house was not just haunted by ghosts, it was a vessel of echoes, and her family was becoming the medium. The personalities of the dead were seeping into the living, overriding her husband and children like a virus corrupting a hard drive. She saw it in the way David now walked, with a heavy, defeated slump that mirrored old photos of Thomas Deaver. She heard it in the lullaby she found herself humming to Maya, a tune she had never heard before, but that felt as familiar as her own heartbeat. It was the same song. A neighbor later told her that Eleanor Deaver used to sing to her children every night. She confronted David, her hands trembling as she held up the yellowed newspaper clipping. He glanced at it, his eyes, once warm and kind, now holding a cold, dismissive glint she did not recognize. "People die, Sarah. It's a sad story, but it has nothing to do with us," he slurred, the smell of whiskey thick on his breath. "This is our home now. We belong here." When he said the word home, it sounded like a final, damning verdict, a closing of a door she would never be able to open again. He was no longer her husband, he was a vessel, a puppet of flesh animated by a dead man's sorrows. The small, reenacted moments became more frequent, more terrifyingly specific. One evening, Leo and David fell into a furious, shouting argument over a broken clock gear, an argument that felt rehearsed, a scene played out 100 times before. Maya would sit in her room and have long, one-sided conversations with Lily, often ending in tears as she whispered, "Don't be scared. He's coming." The house was not just imprinting personalities, forcing her family to live out the final, agonizing days of the Devers, a slow, methodical march towards a preordained, bloody conclusion. Desperate, Sarah packed a bag, determined to flee with her children while David was out. But when she went to get Maya, the little girl was standing at the top of the stairs, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was not her own. "Lily says we can't leave," Maya whispered, her voice a reedy echo of another child's fear. "She says Daddy is coming home, and he's bringing the axe with him. He's angry about the clock. He's always so angry about the clock." In that moment, Sarah knew the house would not let them go. They were part of its story now. The final, tragic chapter. She began to feel the change in herself. A creeping, weary resignation. The will to fight was draining out of her, replaced by a profound, familiar sense of dread and inevitability. She found herself standing in the kitchen, her hand resting on a knife block. A phantom memory of a scream caught in her throat. She was becoming Eleanor Deaver, the wife who had seen the storm coming but was powerless to stop it. The house was not just a stage, it was a predator, slowly digesting her family, absorbing their identities until nothing was left but the echoes of the dead. The anniversary of the murders arrived with a cold, oppressive stillness. The air in the house was thick, heavy, and charged with a terrible, expectant energy. David had spent the entire day in the shed. Rhythmic, metallic sound of a whetstone scraping against steel, echoing across the yard. Leo sat on the porch, not carving, but staring into the woods with a vacant, terrified expression, as if waiting for a monster to emerge. Maya was hiding in her closet, whispering Lily's name over and over again, a frantic, desperate prayer to a ghost who could offer no comfort. That night, Sarah found them all gathered in the living room, bathed in the pale, sickly light of the moon. They were not moving, simply standing in a silent, horrifying tableau. Their faces were not their own. In the slack-jawed terror of her son, she saw the face of the murdered Deaver boy. In the tear-streaked, silent pleading of her daughter, she saw Lily, and in the cold, dead-eyed rage of her husband, she saw the face of killer. The house had finally succeeded. Her family was gone, replaced by the ghosts they had been destined to become from the moment they first stepped over the threshold. David turned to look at her, his movements stiff and unnatural, a puppet pulled by decade-old strings. He was holding a large, freshly sharpened axe, the same one she had seen in the evidence photos from the original crime scene. Raised it slightly, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact, of a script that had to be followed, a voice that was not her husband's. A low, whiskey-soaked growl rumbled from his chest. "You should fix the damn clock, Eleanor," he said. The final act had begun, and the echoes in the walls screamed for their encore. She didn't run. The will to do so was gone, replaced by the ghost of Eleanor Deaver's final, paralyzing fear. She simply stood there, a spectator at her own family's execution, a participant in a murder that had already happened 2 years ago. She saw the axe begin to swing, a silver arc in the moonlight. She heard the whispers of the house swell into a triumphant roar. The story of the Deaver house had always been a tragedy, and it demanded a perfect, unchanging, and endlessly repeating final scene. The walls had been hungry for a decade, and now, finally, they were being fed. The next morning, the sun rose on the silent, beautiful Victorian house. The real estate sign, which had been left in the garage, now stood proudly on the front lawn once more, its for sale text a fresh, hopeful invitation. Inside, the rooms were neat, tidy, and filled with a profound, lingering sadness. The house was quiet again, its hunger sated for now. It was clean, patient, and ready for its next family. It knew that someone else would come along, another family looking for a dream, and it would be waiting to welcome them home, to offer them a place in its terrible, eternal story. Elias Thorne was a man made of paper and silence. As the chief archivist of the Blackwood Municipal Library, he preferred the company of forgotten histories to the fleeting noise of the present. His domain was the sub-basement, a labyrinth of steel shelves where the city's oldest, most neglected books went to die. It was during a routine cataloging that he found it, tucked away in a mislabeled crate, The book was bound in what looked like dark, cured leather, completely unmarked, with no title, no author, no identifying marks of any kind. The pages were thin, almost translucent, and the ink was a strange, rusty brown, as if written in old, dry blood. He took it to his private reading desk. The allure of the unknown, a siren song to his scholarly soul. The story began simply, describing a lone traveler lost in a dense, fog-shrouded forest. The prose was hypnotic, pulling him in with a quiet, creeping dread. As he read, a strange chill permeated the climate-controlled archive room, a damp, earthy smell rising from the pages. He dismissed it as a trick of the mind, the power of suggestion for masterfully written text. The book was a work of art, and he was merely an appreciative audience, lost in the atmosphere of its world. Nothing more. The next evening, when he returned to the book, a single, perfectly preserved oak leaf fell from between the pages. It was still damp, a deep, forest green, impossible for a book that had been sealed in a dry crate for what must have been decades. He touched it, a cold knot of unease tightening in his stomach. The leaf was identical to one described in the passage he had just finished, where the traveler had brushed against an ancient, weeping oak. It was a coincidence, of course, a bizarre and inexplicable one, but his logical mind refused to entertain any other possibility. Even as his instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong, he continued to read, compelled by a force he no longer understood. The traveler in the story stumbled, cutting his hand on a thorny vine. As Elias read the words describing the stinging pain and the welling of blood, he felt sharp, searing pain in his own palm. He dropped the book with a cry. There, across his hand, was a fresh, bleeding scratch, angry and red against his pale skin. Panic, cold and absolute, began to set in. The barrier between the story and his reality was not just blurring, it was dissolving, and he was trapped on the wrong side of the page. The narrative led the traveler to a dilapidated, abandoned cabin in the heart of the woods. As Elias's eyes scanned the description of the rotting wood in the single, grime-covered window, the fluorescent lights above his desk flickered violently and then died, plunging the entire sub-basement into an oppressive, inky blackness. His heart hammered against his ribs. From the far end of the archive, a sound echoed in the sudden silence, the slow, deliberate creak of heavy, unoiled door swinging open, a sound that had no place in the modern, sterile library he knew. He tried to close the book, to sever his connection to the unfolding nightmare, but his hands refused to obey. They were locked in place, his fingers gripping the leather cover with a strength that was not his own. His eyes were glued to the edge, his mind a prisoner, forced to absorb the words as they appeared. He was no longer a reader choosing to engage with a story. He had become a passive vessel, a conduit through which the narrative was flowing, and the price was the surrender of his own free will and the sanctity of his world. The towering steel shelves around him began to groan and twist, the metal warped, the clean lines softening into the gnarled, bark-like texture of ancient trees. The scent of old paper and binding glue was replaced by the rich, loamy smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. A thick, cold fog, identical to the one in the book, rolled across the concrete floor, obscuring his feet and muffling all sound. The library was gone. He was standing in story. He was in the forest, and the terrible, suffocating silence of the page was now his reality. The traveler, his proxy, pushed open the cabin door. Inside, on a dusty table, lay a small, leather-bound diary. Elias's eyes scanned the text, his mind reeling as he read the frantic, looping script. It was the account of the book's previous reader, a woman who had found the volume a century ago. Her entries detailed the same slow, horrifying bleed-through of reality, her growing terror, and her final, chill realization the story had no end. It was a loop, a trap, and she was just the latest soul to be ensnared within its narrative prison. He read on, his own terror mounting, and then he saw it. He didn't know what a paragraph was appearing on the page, the rusty brown ink bleeding into the vellum, as if being written by an invisible hand. It described a man standing in a forest of twin bookshelves, his face pale with fear, his mind shattering as he realized the truth. The book was not just describing his experience, it was actively narrating it. It used his name, He was no longer just an observer. He had written into the tale. He had become a secondary character in the horror story of his own demise. The diary spoke of the forest's true inhabitant, the reason the book existed. It was not just a story, it was a cage, and it was also a feeding ground. Something ancient and patient lived within the narrative, a being made of shadow and ink, the stolen despair of its readers. It fed on the minds of those it trapped, consuming their consciousness and leaving behind only an empty, mindless character doomed to wander the foggy woods forever. The book was a predator, and its pages were its hunting grounds, a place where reality was the bait. A low growl, deep and guttural, echoed through the trees that had once been his bookshelves. It was the sound of something large, something hungry, and it was close. He felt a primal, instinctual fear, terror of prey that knows the hunter is near. The book on the pedestal before him continued to write, its prose now describing the snapping of twigs behind him, the feeling of being watched by 1,000 unseen eyes, the cold certainty of his own impending, scripted doom. He was forced to live out the final, terrifying chapter of a story he could not close. He fought against the book's control with every ounce of his will. The text described the character as frozen in fear, but Elias tried to run. His legs strained, his muscles screamed, but they would not move. The narrative was absolute, a cage of words that held his physical form in an unbreakable grip. He tried to scream, to shout a warning to a world that could no longer hear him, but his throat was locked, his voice stolen by the author of his demise. He was a puppet, and the words on the page were the strings, forcing him to play his part. In a fleeting moment of clarity, he remembered the library's darkest legend. Its founder, a wealthy occultist named Alistair Blackwood, was said to have vanished from his locked study, leaving behind only a single, unmarked book. He had not vanished. He had been the first. The library was not a monument to his life. It was a tomb, a containment facility built around a single, predatory volume, a final, desperate attempt to keep the story from ever being read again. It was a quarantine that, after a century of silence, had finally been breached. The thing from the fog emerged. The book described it in exquisite, loving detail, a shifting, chaotic mass of shadows, held together by a malevolent intelligence. It had no definite shape, only a multitude of wide, unblinking eyes that reflected his own terror back at him. Elias was forced to watch, to feel his sanity fray, and then snap, as the creature enveloped him. The last words he ever read were the ones describing his own mind being unraveled, his consciousness consumed, his story ending in a final, silent scream that would echo forever within the pages. Back in the quiet, sterile sub-basement of the Blackwood Municipal Library, the lights flickered back on. On a small reading desk, an old, leather-bound book sat closed. Its pages were clean, the ink dormant, the air smelled only of old paper and dust. The story was over. The trap was reset. The book was silent, its hunger sated for now, waiting with an infinite, literary patience for the next lonely soul to turn the page and begin the first chapter of their last story. The last thing Ethan remembered was the sharp, sweet smell of chloroform, a chemical blossom that bloomed violently in the back of his throat before wilting into nothing. He awoke not to light or sound, but their absolute and profound absence. He was floating in an ocean of pure black, a void so complete it felt viscous, pressing in on him from all sides. The silence was just as deep, a physical weight that muffled the frantic drumbeat of his heart. He reached out, his hands finding nothing but cool, empty air. He was untethered from the world, a solitary consciousness adrift in a sensory vacuum, the first inhabitant of a new, featureless universe. Panic was a frantic, useless bird beating against the cage of his ribs. He tried to stand, but his legs were clumsy, his equilibrium stolen by the disorienting blackness. His hands eventually found a wall, a surface so smooth and as seamless, it offered no purchase, no hint of a door or window. He followed it, shuffling his feet, one hand tracing the featureless perimeter of his prison. He circled the entire space, a small, perfectly square room, finding no exit, no seam, no imperfection. It was a perfectly sealed box, and he was the only thing inside it. The realization settled not with a crash. but with the cold, quiet finality of a tomb being sealed for eternity. Time ceased to be a river and became a stagnant pool, without the sun or moon, without the rhythm of the world. His internal clock shattered. He slept when exhaustion claimed him and woke to the same unchanging darkness. The only marker of passing moments was the silent, almost magical appearance of a tray through a nearly imperceptible slot at the base of one wall. A bottle of water and a tasteless, nutrient-rich paste were his only sustenance. This silent, regular delivery was his only connection to an outside world. A cruel, minimalist ritual that confirmed his captivity without ever revealing the nature of his captor. With no input from his eyes or ears, his mind turned violently inward. Memories, once soft, faded things, returned with a terrifying, hallucinatory clarity. He relived his first kiss, the scent of girlfriend's hair, the warmth of her hand in his, with such vividness that he would reach out for her in the dark. He saw the face of his mother, heard her laughter echoing in the silent chamber of his skull. These moments of remembered lighting and sound were a sweet, agonizing torture, ghosts of a life that felt more real than the suffocating reality of the blackness he now inhabited. He was haunted not by specters, but by his own past. The silence began to fester. It was no longer an absence of sound, but a presence in itself, a high-pitched, constant ringing that lived in the space between his ears. It was the sound of his own nervous system screaming into void. Soon, other sounds joined it, phantom whispers that seemed to slither out of the corners of the room. They were formless, speaking a language of pure dread that he could not understand but felt in the marrow of his bones. He would press his hands to his ears, but the sounds were already inside, a part of the new, horrifying architecture of his mind. He began to talk to himself, his own voice a shocking, alien intrusion into the oppressive quiet. At first, it was a comfort, a proof of his own existence. He would narrate his actions, tell himself stories, sing fragments of songs he could barely remember. But the silence would swallow his words the moment they left his lips, leaving no echo, no resonance. His voice sounded thin and pathetic, a stranger's voice in the dark. He started to fear the sound of it, the way it only amplified the crushing, profound emptiness of his world. The silence was a predator, and his words were a foolish attempt to scare it away. His sense of self began to fray. Without a mirror, without the reflection of his own image in the eyes of another, his face became a vague concept. He would trace the contours of his cheeks, his nose, his lips, trying to remember the man he was. He felt his muscles begin to soften, his body growing weaker in the enforced stillness. He was becoming a ghost, his physical form slowly dissolving into the darkness that surrounded him, leaving only the terrified, disembodied consciousness behind. It was a story that was slowly erasing itself. Sentence by painful sentence, the darkness, too, began to play tricks on him. It was no longer a uniform black, but a canvas for his unraveling mind. He would see faint, shifting shapes in his peripheral vision, fleeting figures of gray and deeper black that would vanish the moment he tried to focus on them. He saw faces in the gloom, their features contorted in silent screams, their eyes wide with a shared, eternal terror. The void was not empty, it was populated by the phantoms of his own starved senses, a gallery of horrors curated by his own breaking psyche. One day, after an eternity of silence, there was a sound. It was a single, deliberate tap on the wall opposite him. It was not loud, but in the context of his world, it was a thunderclap that jolted every nerve in his body. He froze, his breath catching in his chest. It was the first external, real sound he had heard in months, perhaps years. It was a message. It was his captor, the silent god of his tiny universe, reminding him that he was not alone, that he was being watched, that his suffering was the subject of a quiet, patient, and terrible observation. He became obsessed with the food slot. It was his oracle, his only point of contact. He would sit for what felt like hours, his face pressed to the floor, waiting for the soft, metallic slide that announced his meal. Began to leave things by the slot, a button from his shirt, a thread from his trousers, small, pathetic offerings to the unseen entity that controlled his existence. He was praying, he realized, to a god of darkness, silence, begging for a sign, for a response. for anything other than this perfect, soul-crushing emptiness. His offerings were always gone when the next tray arrived. One cycle, instead of just the tray, a small, smooth stone was pushed through the slot. It was cool and heavy in his hand, the first new texture he had felt since his capture. It was a miracle. He wept, clutching the stone to his chest. He spent hours, days, just feeling its surface, its weight, its solidity. Its solidity. It was an anchor in his sea of nothingness, a piece of the real world. It was proof that something other than himself and the darkness existed. It became his most precious possession, his friend, his sanity, his entire world contained in the palm of his hand. The next time the tray arrived, he held the stone out, an offering of thanks. The tray was pulled back, and for a moment, he felt a soft, brushing pressure against his fingertips as the stone was gently taken from his hand. Then the slot closed. The loss was a physical blow, a vacuum created in the center of his chest. The cruelty was so profound, so exquisitely calculated, that it shattered the last vestiges of his hope. He had given a universe only to have it snatched away. It was a lesson in despair, a demonstration of absolute power. His mind finally broke its tether to reason. He no longer fought the hallucinations, he welcomed them. He built a new reality in the dark, populated by the whispering phantoms and the shifting shapes. He had long, one-sided conversations with the memory of his girlfriend, her face now a beautiful, terrifying blur. He was the king of his own lightless kingdom, the ruler of an empire of insanity. He found a strange, terrifying peace in the madness. The dark was no longer a prison, it was his home, a sanctuary that protected him from the painful memories of light and sound. After a lifetime had passed, a sound unlike any other ripped through his world. It was the grinding screech of metal, the groan of long unused hinges. A thin, vertical line of light appeared in the wall, a blade of pure, agonizing brightness that sliced through his darkness. It widened, becoming a doorway. A figure stood silhouetted against the impossible glare, a tall, thin shape that was as featureless as the darkness had once been. The figure watched him for a long moment, then turned and walked away, leaving the door wide open. Ethan crawled toward the light, his eyes streaming, his skin screaming at the unfamiliar touch of the air. He reached the threshold and looked out into a long, white hallway. It was freedom. It was the world. But the light was afire, the ambient hum of the building, a deafening roar. The world was a chaotic, violent assault on senses that had learned to crave nothingness. He scrambled backward, away from the terrifying glare, back into cool, quiet comfort of his cell. He curled into a ball in the far corner, covered his burning eyes, and prayed for his God to return, to close the door, and to grant him the eternal, merciful peace of dark. The first body was an overture to a symphony of slaughter, a grotesque announcement left in the sterile white of a high-end gallery. Detective Elias Thorne stood over the remains of the city's most celebrated sculptor, a man now reduced to a mere metal component. His left arm, the very limb that had carved masterpieces from marble, was gone. It wasn't a savage amputation. The wound was a marvel of surgical precision, cauterized with an expert's hand. The absence was art. On the wall behind the corpse, painted in the victim's own blood, was a symbol Elias had never seen: a spiral of interlocking hooks, a sigil of profane geometry that seemed to mock the very concept of sanctity, whispering of a faith that famed its God not in the heavens, but in the charnel house. Elias felt the cold dread of the unfamiliar seep into his bones, a chilling premonition that this was no ordinary act of violence. This was a ritual, a harvest. The precision of the cut spoke of a steady, practiced hand, one who knew anatomy as intimately as a lover. There was no rage in the wound, only purpose. The symbol on the wall pulsed under the forensic lights, an obscene eye staring back at him from the abyss of a twisted doctrine. He could almost hear the chant that must have accompanied the act, a prayer recited over the severing of flesh. This killer wasn't just taking a life, he was collecting a tithe, a piece of a much larger, more terrifying puzzle that was only just beginning to take shape. 2 days later, the second piece was claimed. A renowned ballerina, celebrated for the ethereal grace of her legs, was found in her studio. Her right leg had been taken, from the hip down, with the same impossible neatness. The same hooked spiral adorned her mirror, a bloody signature connecting the two atrocities. City, once a bastion of blissful ignorance, erupted in a cacophony of fear. News outlets, in their insatiable hunger for sensation, branded the killer, the assembler, a name that captured the public's darkest imaginings. Panic became a tangible entity, a fog that crept through the streets, poisoning the minds of all who breathed it in. Elias felt the weight of every terrified glance, the pressure of a city, holding its breath, waiting for the next cut. He retreated into the dusty silence of the precinct's archives. The scent of aging paper, a strange comfort in a world suddenly reeking of blood and antiseptic. He surrounded himself with the arcane, with forgotten histories of heretical sects and death cults, searching for the key to the hooked spiral. The symbol eluded him, appearing in no known text, a new scripture for a new, bloodthirsty god. With every page he turned, the sense of dread solidified into certainty. He was not hunting a man. He was hunting a belief, a contagion of the soul that had found purchase in the city's dark corners and was now demanding its pound of flesh. Piece by gruesome piece, the third victim, a famous orator known for his booming, persuasive voice, confirmed Elias's most terrifying theory. He was found in his study, his larynx and tongue expertly excised. The pattern was now undeniable, horrifying tapestry of human talent being unraveled thread by thread. The assembler wasn't just collecting body parts, they were collecting attributes, the physical vessels of perfection, the sculptor's creative hand, the dancer's graceful leg, the orator's commanding voice. This was not about murder, it was about creation. A chilling realization washed over Elias. These stolen pieces were not being discarded. They were being kept, preserved for a purpose too monstrous for a sane mind to fully comprehend. A voice, raspy and distorted through a scrambler, shattered the silence of his office late one night. It was a whisper, a crack in the cult's wall of secrecy, a follower whose faith had been eroded by fear. The voice spoke a place, a sanctuary where the new god was taking shape, a derelict warehouse by the city's forgotten industrial waterfront. It spoke of the children of the composite, and the promise of eternal life granted by the god they were building from the flesh, the gifted. The call ended as abruptly as it began, leaving Elias in a silence that was now heavier, more menacing than before. The address of venomous promise echoing in his mind. The warehouse was a cathedral of decay, its cavernous interior smelling of rust, stagnant water, and something else, something cloyingly sweet, like incense mixed with the metallic tang of blood. In the center of the vast space, illuminated by a sickly yellow light, stood an altar of welded scrap metal, and upon it, Elias saw it. The arm of the sculptor, pale and lifeless, had been stitched with black thread to the torso of some unknown victim. Beside it, the leg of the ballerina was attached at the hip. It was a grotesque mockery of life, a blasphemous sculpture in its nascent stages, the first strokes of a masterpiece of pure horror. On a lectern beside the altar lay their Bible, a heavy tome bound in what Elias knew, with a sickening certainty, was human skin. He opened it, his gloved fingers trembling. The pages were filled with elegant, spider-shirked, and detailed anatomical drawings. It was a manifesto, a blueprint for divinity. It described a prophecy of the coming of the composite god, a being assembled from the most perfect parts of humanity. This new deity, would walk among them, a messiah of stitched flesh, and grant its loyal creators dominion over the one thing they feared most, death itself. He was so engrossed in the profane text that he didn't hear them until it was too late. A floorboard creaked behind him, and the air grew cold. The shadows at the periphery of the light began to coalesce into human forms. They were the children of composite, their faces obscured by sackcloth hoods, their movements silent and synchronized. They emerged from the darkness not with the frenzy of madmen, but with the calm, unwavering purpose of true believers. Whispers slithered from the darkness, a sibilant chorus of devotion to their unfinished god, their voices weaving a net of sound that promised only pain and sacrifice. Elias drew his weapon, the click of the hammer echoing in the vast, silent space. The cultists moved, not as individuals, but as a single, flowing entity. a wave of black-robed fanaticism. He fired, the shots deafeningly loud, but they kept coming, their faith a shield against the bullets. He ran, plunging into the labyrinthine maze of rusted shelves and forgotten machinery that filled the warehouse. The chase was a nightmare, their soft, padding footsteps a constant, terrifying rhythm behind him. They were relentless, their eyes, visible through the crude holes in their hoods, burning with a cold, zealous fire that spoke of a complete surrender to their hideous cause. He found a window, shattering the grimy glass and tumbling out into the cold night air, a searing pain lancing through his side where a blade had found its mark. He stumbled away, the whispers of the cult fading behind him, but he knew this was far from over. Back at the precinct, bleeding and exhausted, he laid out his story, presenting the skin-bound book as proof. His superiors saw only the ravings of a detective, pushed past his breaking point. They saw a lone, brilliant killer, a surgeon with a god complex. They couldn't, or wouldn't, see the truth that a cancer of faith was metastasizing in the heart of their city. Now a pariah, suspended from duty and haunted by the faces of the victims, Elias became a ghost. He operated from the shadows, his only guide the cult's profane Bible. The book spoke of celestial alignments, of specific stellar constellations required for each part of the god's assembly. He traced the star charts, his fingers following the paths of dead stars, and saw the pattern. He saw where the next piece would be taken, where the cult would gather to harvest part that would give their monstrous creation its semblance of life. He knew he was racing against the heavens themselves, a lone warrior against a tide of madness. The abandoned cathedral stood silhouetted against a sky bruised with the colors of twilight, the celestial alignment just hours away. Inside, dozens of hooded figures chanted in a low monotone, their voices reverberating through the desecrated nave. On the grand altar, the creature lay waiting. It was nearly 9 feet tall, a patchwork giant of mismatched limbs and skin tones, its form a testament to the cult's bloody work. And on a smaller, stone slab, laid final piece, a young, terrified woman, chosen for the strength and purity of her heart. The high priest, his face a mask of ecstatic piety, raised a ceremonial obsidian knife, its edge gleaming in the candlelight. Elias burst through the heavy oak doors, his shotgun roaring, scattering the chanting flock. He was a whirlwind of desperate violence, a single, righteous storm against a sea of fanatics. He fought his way through throng. His goal, the altar, his world narrowed to the gleaming tip of the obsidian blade descending toward the young woman's chest. The air in the cathedral grew thick, heavy with an unseen energy, a palpable pressure that promised an imminent terrible birth. He reached the altar just as the knife plunged, just as the perfect, still beating heart was lifted from its cradle of bone and flesh. The high priest, with a triumphant cry, placed the heart into the gaping cavity in the creature's chest. As the final, black thread was pulled tight, a profound tremor shook the cathedral from its very foundations. Dust rained from the vaulted ceiling. Then, a silence, absolute and terrifying, fell upon the room. The creature's eyes, a mosaic of blue, brown, and green irises taken from a dozen different souls, snapped open. A sound, a low, wet, guttural vibration, tore itself from the stitched-together throat. It was the first cry of a newborn god, a sound that promised not salvation, but an eternity of pain. Elias stared into those mismatched eyes and knew, with chilling finality, that he had not prevented a horror. He had only witnessed its birth. Leo was a collector of forgotten places, an urban explorer who found beauty in decay. His pride was the old Blackwood Asylum, a skeletal ruin on the city's edge that had been silent for 50 years. Legends clung to it like ivy, tales of strange lights and whispers carried on the wind. Armed with a camera and a healthy dose of skepticism, he slipped through a gap in the perimeter fence one moonless night. The building's jagged silhouette, a wound against the starry sky. The air inside was cold and still, thick with the dust of dead memories. He moved through the derelict wards, his footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence, unaware that he had just entered a tomb where the only thing buried was sleep itself. He found the first sign of life in the old infirmary. It wasn't graffiti or the usual debris left by squatters. It was a series of cots, each one surrounded by a bizarre assembly of equipment powerful. Industrial-grade floodlights aimed at pillow, speakers wired to emit a constant, low-frequency hum, and IV drips filled with a clear, viscous liquid. On a nearby table, a leather-bound journal was left open. The handwriting inside was a frantic, spidery scrawl, the diary of a man's descent into a very specific kind of hell. The author wrote of a figure he called the Watcher, a man who promised a state of pure consciousness, an existence free from the disease of dreams. The journal was a harrowing account of forced wakefulness. The author described the first few days as a state of heightened awareness, the world seeming sharper, more vibrant, but then came the cracks. He wrote of the shadow spiders that crawled at the edge of his vision, of conversations with people who weren't there. His own thoughts became a looping, inescapable cacophony. The pages grew more chaotic, the words devolving into nonsensical patterns and desperate pleas for one moment of darkness, 1 second of silence. The final entry was a single, shakily drawn eye, wide and bloodshot, staring up from the page, a perfect portrait of a mind that had been systematically dismantled. A floorboard creaked behind him. Leo spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but the hallway was empty. A sudden, blinding light erupted from one of the floodlights by the cots, making him cry out and shield his eyes. The low-frequency hum from the speakers kicked in, a nauseating vibration that seemed to burrow directly into his brain. The door to the infirmary slammed shut with a deafening bang, the sound of a steel trap snapping closed. A calm, dispassionate voice drifted from a small intercom on the wall, a voice that was both soothing and utterly devoid of warmth. A new patient has arrived. Welcome to the Great Awakening. Please, do not resist your ment. He was trapped. Psalm. The man who called himself the Watcher was a ghost in the machine of the asylum, his voice the only sign of his presence. He spoke to Leo constantly through the intercoms, a calm, relentless monologue on the virtues sleeplessness. He called sleep the little death, a nightly surrender to chaos and primitive fear. True evolution, he claimed, was to transcend this biological flaw, to exist in a state of perpetual, unbroken thought. He saw himself not as a torturer, but as a liberator, a philosopher whose theories required a living, unwilling test subject. Leo was now the latest specimen in this horrifying, sleepless experiment. The first 24 hours were a war of attrition. The lights never dimmed, the hum never ceased. When Leo tried to cover his head or find a dark corner, a series of sharp, jarring alarms would blare from the speakers, prevent any chance of rest. The Watcher would speak to him, his voice a constant presence. Your mind is resisting its own potential. Leo, the fog of fatigue is a cage. We must break it. Food and water appeared through a small slot in the door, the water laced with a stimulant that kept his nerves frayed and his body buzzing with a false, jittery energy. Sleep was not just denied, it was actively hunted and destroyed. By the third day, the world had begun to fray at the edges. The peeling paint on the walls seemed to writhe and breathe, forming grotesque faces that would grimace and mouth silent words at him. He saw movement in the shadows, fleeting figures that would vanish the moment he turned to face them. He started having long, detailed conversations with his camera, the only familiar object in his sterile prison. His own thoughts began to echo, repeating themselves in a maddening loop, and they lost all meaning. He was losing his grip on the anchor of reality, drifting into a sea of waking nightmares. The Watcher's voice became a source of twisted comfort in the chaos. He was the only other conscious being in Leo's world, the calm center of the storm that was raging in his mind. He would ask Leo questions, probing his fracturing psyche. What do you see in the corners? Leo, are they your fears, or are they the first glimpse of a reality that sleep has hidden from you? He was guiding Leo's descent, narrating his fall into madness, with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a chemical reaction. He was not just breaking Leo's mind, he was studying the pieces as they fell apart. On what he thought was the fifth day, time having become a fluid, meaningless concept, the door to the infirmary finally opened. The Watcher stood there, a tall, gaunt man, in a simple orderly's uniform, his eyes possessing a terrifying, zealous clarity. He held a syringe filled with the same clear liquid from the IV drips. "You have done well," he said, his voice the same calm tone from the intercom. "The vessel is almost clean. The fine impurities of the subconscious are being burned away. It is time for the final step, a baptism. This will sever the final chain to the dream world and allow you to see what I see." Leo, running on a fuel of pure adrenaline and terror, saw his chance. He was no longer bound by logic or reason, only by a primal instinct to survive. As the Watcher approached, Leo screamed, not in fear, but of a wild, incoherent rage, a sound of a mind pushed beyond its limits. He kicked over one of the heavy floodlights, sending it crashing to the floor. The bulb shattered, plunging half the room into a sudden shark. For the first time in days, he was in shadow, and the momentary relief was like a gasp of air to a drowning man. The Watcher recoiled from the darkness as if it were a physical blow, hissing in pain. His eyes, so accustomed to the perpetual, searing light, were now his weakness. Leo scrambled past him, out of the infirmary and into the labyrinthine corridors of the asylum. The building itself had become a part of his nightmare. The hallways stretched into impossible lengths. The doors seemed to switch places, and the whispers of the asylum's original patients seemed to join company in his head. He was running from a monster, but also from the collapsing architecture of his own mind. He found his way to a high window in the asylum's bell tower, the first real light he had seen in days. The rising sun was a glorious, painful explosion of color. He looked down and saw the Watcher emerging from the main entrance, his face turned up towards him, his expression one of disappointment, like a priest who had just watched a soul refuse salvation. Leo didn't hesitate. He found the old bell rope, thick and frayed, and with a final, desperate surge of strength, he sent the ancient, iron bell crashing down from its moorings. The bell fell, a dark meteor that struck the Watcher with a sickening, final thud. The man who had sought to liberate the world from sleep was crushed beneath the very instrument that had once marked the passage of time. The rhythm of waking, dreaming. Leo stumbled out of the asylum and into the clean morning air. A survivor, but not a victor. The world outside seemed thin and unreal. A fragile film stretched over a reality of shadow spiders and whispering walls. He was found wandering on a nearby road, incoherent and trembling. By a passing motorist, he spent weeks in a hospital, but the doctors could do little for him. They could heal his body, but his mind was a shadow landscape. Sleep, when it finally came, was no longer a refuge. It was a place of absolute terror, a dark room where a calm, dispassionate voice would whisper to him from the corners, asking him what he could see in shadows, promising him that soon he would be pure. He now lives in a world without rest. Every closing of his eyes is a fall into the Blackwood Asylum. Every shadow, a potential monster. He is a ghost in his own life, perpetually haunted by the waking nightmare he survived. The Watcher maybe is dead, but his philosophy lives on, a malignant seed planted in the fertile, sleep-deprived soil of Leo's mind. He had escaped the asylum, but he would never, ever truly be free from the waking room, a prison whose walls were now the inside of his own skull. Detective Harding's first thought upon seeing the figure in the fountain was that it was a prank, a masterful piece of hyper-realistic art left to shock the morning commuters. It was a woman, kneeling in a pose of serene prayer, her hands clasped and her face tilted towards the gray, indifferent sky. Her skin was a flawless, alabaster white, catching the dawn light with a soft, waxy sheen. But as he drew closer, the details became unnervingly perfect. The delicate strands of hair, the fine pores on her skin, the subtle tension in her knuckles. No sculptor, no matter how gifted, could achieve this level of lifelike detail. It wasn't a statue of woman, it was the woman herself, preserved. The coroner's office was a place of cold science, but this case defied all logic. Dr. Evans ran her gloved hand over the figure's arm, her brow furrowed in disbelief. The body was encased in a thin, perfectly uniform layer of what appeared to be beeswax, but of an impossible purity. There were no external wounds, no signs of struggle. An internal scan revealed the horrifying truth. The victim's lungs were completely filled with the same wax, solidifying them into dense, useless weights. She had been drowned, not in water, but in boiling wax, her final, agonizing breath captured and immortalized within this beautiful, terrible shell. A week later, a second saint appeared. This time, it was a man, a well-known corporate raider, positioned on a park bench as if reading a morning paper. The same impossible artistry, the same waxy perfection, the same cause of death. The media, in a storm of sensationalism, dubbed the killer, the Chandler, and a wave of quiet, creeping terror settled over the city. There was a pattern to the victims. They were individuals known for their public sin, greed, corruption, avarice. The killer was not just murdering, they were making a statement, creating a gallery of frozen sinners, purified and put on display for the world to judge. Harding found himself lost in the city's forgotten archives, chasing whispers of obscure sects and bizarre purification rituals. He found a reference in a dusty, leather-bound tome on fringe religious movements. It spoke of a splinter group known as Lucernarians, a cult that believed the human soul was a flame and the body was a corrupt, tallow-like vessel that needed to be rendered pure. They believed that by encasing a sinner in pure wax at the moment of death, they could trap the soul in a state of grace, creating a holy relic, an eternal candle to light the way for the faithful. The cult's philosophy was a tapestry of madness and art. They saw their work not as murder, but as a sacred act of preservation. They were curators of souls, saving the corrupt from their own decay. Harding read their twisted doctrine, which described the selection of a vessel, the ritualistic heating of the wax, and the final, agonizing immersion as a form of baptism by fire and fluid. The victims' terror, their final struggle for air, was considered the last vestiges of their impurity being burned away, leaving behind only a perfect, serene vessel for their newly cleansed soul. A break in the case came from an unlikely source. An art supply store owner recalled selling a massive, unusual quantity of high-grade, decolorized beeswax to a man who paid in cash. The man was quiet, intense, and had a small, intricate tattoo on his wrist, a stylized flame inside a perfect circle. The description was vague, but the symbol was a key. Harding cross-referenced the symbol with known cult markings and found a match. A sigil associated with defunct candle factory on the industrial outskirts of the city, a place that had been abandoned for decades. The factory was a brick monolith, its windows dark and grimy, reeking of decay and something else, something cloyingly sweet and chemical. Harding moved through the derelict building, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous, side spaces. The air grew warmer as he descended into the lower levels, the sweet smell of melting wax becoming almost overpowering. He was not just in a factory, he was in a temple. The walls were lined with niches, each one holding a candle that cast a flickering, dancing light on the damp stone walls, leading him deeper into the cult's sanctuary. He found their gallery in the main rendering vat chamber. It was a silent, horrifying congregation. A dozen figures stood or knelt in the gloom, their pale, waxy forms illuminated by the candlelight. He recognized some of their faces from the news, victims of unsolved disappearances from years past. They were the Chandler's forgotten works, a private collection of gilded saints. Their faces were all frozen in the same placid, empty expression, their eyes staring into eternity. It was a museum of stolen lives, a testament to a quiet, patient, and prolific madness. From the shadows, a figure emerged. He was a man with a calm, beatific smile, and eyes that burned with the unwavering fire of the true believer. The tattoo of the flame was on his wrist. "You see, detective," he said, his voice a soft, hypnotic murmur. "You see them not as I do. You see corpses. I see salvation. I see the beauty of permanence. In a world of filth and decay, I create things of pure, eternal light. I give these corrupted souls a gift they could never achieve in their own messy lives. Perfection." The leader gestured towards a heavy iron door, from which a low, rhythmic chanting could be heard. "We are in the middle of a new consecration. I'm afraid, a very special one. A soul so mired in the sin of disbelief that its purification will be our greatest masterpiece." Harding's blood ran cold. He knew, with a sickening certainty, who the cult had chosen as their ultimate symbol of a world that refused to see their light. He drew his weapon, the clue of the hammer, echoing in the vast, silent chamber of the dead. He kicked the door open to a scene of medieval horror. In the center of the room, suspended by chains over a massive, steaming cauldron of bubbling white wax, was Dr. Evans, the coroner. Her face was pale with terror, her scientific mind unable to process the ritualistic nightmare she was now a part of. Hooded figures surrounded the vat, their voices a low, monotonous drone. The leader stood before them, a ceremonial ladle in his hand, ready to begin the final, terrible baptism that would turn the woman of science into an object of faith. The disbeliever, the leader said, his smile never faltering as he looked at Harding. She spent her days cutting up the dead, looking for answers in cold, dead flesh. She could never see the spirit, the flame. We will make her a beacon. We will purify her doubt and turn her into a testament to our truth. Her light will shine for 1,000 years. He turned his serene gaze back to his terrified victim, raising the ladle as the chanting of his followers grew lighter, a wave of sound that vibrated in Harding's bones. The confrontation was a chaotic blur of motion and violence. Harding fired, the shots deafening in the enclosed space. The cultists scattered, their sacred ritual shattered by the profane intrusion of the outside world. The leader, with a look of profound disappointment, lunged not at Harding, but at the mechanism holding Dr. Evans aloft. He was not trying to escape, he was trying to complete his masterpiece, to send her plunging into the boiling wax before his work could be interrupted. In the struggle, the massive cauldron tipped. A tidal wave of molten wax surged across the floor, a river of scalding, liquid light. The cultists shrieked as the wax engulfed them, their bodies instantly encased, their forms frozen in postures of agony. The leader, caught in the flow, turned to Harding, his face a mask of ecstatic revelation as the wax rose up his body. "Behold," he whispered, as the wax covered his face, sealing his final, triumphant words, "Perfection." Harding pulled Dr. Evans to safety, the heat of the cooling wax a furnace at their backs. The room was now a new gallery, a tableau of instant, horrified saints, their final moments of terror preserved for eternity. As they led her out of the factory, past the silent, serene figures in the main chamber, Harding felt a profound and chilling thought. The Chandler was gone, but his work remained. The city was now home to a hidden museum, beautiful, perfect, and utterly silent horrors, each one a testament to the terrifying power of a faith that could see murder as an act of creation. Detective Harding's first thought was that he had walked into an art installation, not a crime scene. The body of renowned cellist, Elias Vance, was positioned in the center of his soundproofed studio, but not in any way Harding had ever seen a body before. Vance was seated on a custom-made spike, his spine arched back in a grotesque curve. His ribs had been meticulously exposed and separated, and his own entrails, stretched and treated, were strung across the cage of his bones like the strings of a macabre cello. A single, horsehair bow lay at the base of the gruesome instrument, as if inviting someone to play a lament for the man who had become his own final, terrible performance. The forensics team was silent, their usual gallows humor completely absent in the face of such methodical insanity. The killer had left no fingerprints, no stray fibers, nothing but his horrifying masterpiece. The only clue was a small piece of parchment resting on the music stand, bearing a single, perfectly penned musical note, a C sharp, impossibly black against the stark white paper. The press, with their typical flair for the dramatic, had a name for the killer, Nightfall, the Maestro. The name stuck, a chillingly appropriate title for a murderer who was also a composer, an artist whose medium was not wood or wire, but human flesh and bone. Harding immersed himself in the victim's life, searching for a motive, a shadow, a hint of the monster who had done this. Elias Vance was a prodigy, a man who lived for his music, but he was also a purist who had many rivals. The list of potential suspects was a who's who of the city's classical music scene, a world of polite smiles and vicious, backstabbing ambition. Yet, none of the rivalry seemed to warrant this level of theatric brutality. This wasn't a crime of passion or professional jealousy. It was a statement, a philosophical treatise written in blood and sinew, and Harding had no idea how to read it. 2 weeks later, the maestro conducted his second movement. A famous flutist, a young woman named Clara, was found in her apartment. Her lungs had been removed and preserved, treated with some unknown resin until they were translucent and hard. Her trachea and larynx had been reconfigured with a series of silver stops and valves, turning her very breath into a wind instrument of nightmarish design. The same signature was present, a single musical note, this time a F, resting on her empty music stand. The city was gripped by a fear so profound it was almost silent. Concert halls fell empty as musicians became afraid to even touch their instruments. The connection, when Harding finally found it, was both obscure and damning. Both Elias Vance and Clara had, in the months before their deaths, been the subjects of scathing reviews by a notoriously cruel music critic named Antoine Valdemar. Valdemar was a recluse, a man whose critiques were legendary for their venom and their erudition. He wrote of music not as an art form, but as a failed attempt to capture the primordial resonance of the flesh. His columns were filled with bizarre, philosophical ramblings about how the only true music was the sound of the body itself, the percussion of the heartbeat, the wind of the lungs, the strings of the nerves. Harding delved into Valdemar's past, uncovering a history of academic brilliance that had curdled into obsessive madness. He had been a surgeon before he was a critic, expelled from a prestigious medical program for conducting unauthorized experiments with cadavers, attempting to measure the resonant frequencies of human tissue. He believed that the body was the ultimate instrument and that modern musicians, with their wooden boxes and metal tubes, were merely creating a pale, soulless imitation dish of the symphony that was locked inside every living person. The detective felt a cold certainty. Valdemar wasn't just writing about his philosophy, he was putting it into practice. The critic lived in a grand, decaying brownstone, insulated from the world by wealth and eccentricity. Harding began a quiet, off-the-books surveillance, watching the house from the rain-slicked street. He saw nothing but the occasional flicker of gaslight in the windows and heard nothing but the faint, haunting strains of a melody he did not recognize, a melody that seemed to be played on instruments that were both familiar and deeply, horribly wrong. He knew he was listening to a rehearsal, a tuning session for an orchestra of the dead. Valdemar was not just killing, he was building his ensemble. Piece by agonizing piece, the next target became terrifyingly obvious. Valdemar's latest review had been a masterpiece of cruelty, a public vivisection of the city's most beloved opera singer, a soprano named Isabella. He had written that her voice was a cage for the true song of her anatomy, and that her diaphragm, the source of her power, was wasted on the vulgarity of opera. Harding knew Valdemar would see her as the perfect addition to his orchestra, a voice section made manifest. He had to get to her, to warn her, to stop the maestro before he could claim his lead vocalist. He raced to Isabella's penthouse apartment, his siren cutting a swathe through the terrified city. He burst into her apartment to find it empty, a window overlooking the balcony swinging gently in the night breeze. On her piano, propped open, a page of Verdi, was a single sheet of parchment. It held a high G, the note for which Isabella was most famous. Harding was too late, but he saw it then, a faint, almost invisible trail of what looked like sawdust, resin leading from the balcony to the fire escape. The maestro was close. The performance was about to begin. The trail led him to an abandoned vaudeville theater, a place that had been boarded up for 50 years. Harding slipped through a side door into the cavernous, dust-choked darkness. A single, dim light illuminated the stage, and there, arranged in a perfect orchestral semicircle, were the bodies of Elias and Clara. They were preserved, polished, and mounted on stands, looking like exhibits in a madman's museum. And in the center, on a tilted operating table, lay the unconscious form of Isabella, her body prepped for its terrible transformation. Antoine Valdemar stood over her, dressed not in a killer's rags but in a pristine conductor's tuxedo. He held not a knife, but a collection of surgical tools that gleamed like silver batons. He turned as Harding entered, his face not one of madness, but of serene, artistic focus. "Detective," he said, his voice calm and melodic, "you have arrived just in time for the final tuning. Isn't she magnificent? The resonance of her vocal cords is unparalleled. I am not destroying a singer. I am liberating a song that has been trapped in her throat for her entire life. It's over, Valdemar, Harding said, his voice tight, his gun steady. Valdemar simply smiled, a sad, pitying expression on his face. Over, my dear man. It has just begun. Can't you hear it, the symphony of life itself? The music that plays in the silence between heartbeats. These artists, in their ignorance, sought to capture it with wood and catgut. I am simply giving them the honor of becoming the music itself. I am a murderer. I am a liberator of sound. He raised a sharp, gleaming tool, preparing to make the first incision on Isabella's throat. The ensuing struggle was a chaotic, horrifying ballet on the stage of the dead. Harding fired, the shot echoing unnaturally in the acoustically perfect hall. The bullet struck Valdemar in the shoulder, but the man barely flinched, his face a mask of ecstatic purpose. He lunged, and they crashed into the grotesque orchestra. Harding fell against the human cello, and a deep, resonant, horrible moan filled the theater as the entrail strings vibrated against cage of ribs. The sound was a chord of pure, unadulterated agony. Valdemar scrambled to his feet, his eyes wild. You hear it? Don't you? He screamed over the ghastly sound. The purity, the truth in that note. He grabbed the horsehair bow and lunged again, not at Harding, but at Allo, trying to play his masterpiece. Harding tackled him, and they fell into the darkness of the orchestra pit. Harding felt a sharp, blinding pain in his side, and the world began to fade to the sound of that one, terrible, vibrating note from the stage above. His last conscious thought was of the silence that would follow. He wondered if Valdemar was right, if there was a music hidden in the machinery of the body. He felt his own heartbeat, slow, percussive rhythm, the final drumbeat, a symphony of one. He didn't know if he would live or die, if he had stopped the maestro, or merely become another instrument, waiting in the darkness for the conductor to finally take the stage and begin the grand, terrible performance. The room had no features, a perfect cube of soundproofed, seamless gray that gave no hint of time or place. For Ethan, it had been the entire universe for what felt like an eternity. His only companion was the man who called himself the conductor, a figure of unnerving calm, who moved with the quiet efficiency of a librarian. He never raised his voice, never showed anger, and it was this placid demeanor that terrified Ethan more than any overt threat. The conductor was not a poet, he was an artist, a composer, and Ethan's breaking mind was to be his symphony, a magnum opus of meticulously orchestrated despair. His body was a canvas of bruises and healing wounds, but the true torture had not yet begun. The conductor sat across from him on a simple stool, his hands resting on a small, polished wooden box. The performance is about to begin. Ethan, he said, his voice a soft, reasonable murmur. In the room next, this one, your wife, Anna, and your daughter, Lily, are waiting. Their fate is tied directly to yours. For every moment of pain you endure for me, they will be granted a moment of peace. But there is a rule, a single, simple rule. You must be silent. Any sound you make, a gasp, a whimper, a scream, will be a signal to my associate to increase the intensity of their session. Your silence is their only shield. He opened the box, revealing a series of gleaming, sterile instruments that looked as though they belonged in a surgeon's kit. We will begin simply, the conductor said, selecting a pair of pliers. He then pressed a button on a remote, and a speaker, hidden somewhere in the seamless gray walls, crackled to life. It was Lily's voice, small and trembling with a fear that lanced straight into Ethan's heart. Daddy, I'm scared. Where are you? The sound was so clear, so real, it was as if she were just on the other side of the wall. The conductor took Ethan's left hand, his grip gentle but firm, and positioned the pliers over his thumbnail. The pain was a blinding, white-hot nova, but it was nothing compared to the sound of Anna's voice that followed. Please, just leave her alone. Take me instead. The recording was a masterpiece of terror, filled with the sounds of struggle, of fabric tearing, of a man's gruff, muffled voice giving orders. The conductor worked slowly, methodically, his focus absolute. Ethan bit down on his own tongue, the coppery taste of blood filling his mouth. his entire being focused on one singular goal: silence. He was a statue of pure will, his mind a fortress with walls built of love and a desperate, clawing hope that his suffering had meaning. Days bled into a gray, timeless fog. The conductor was a patient artist, never pushing too far, too fast. He would inflict a precise, calculated amount of pain, then allow Ethan time to recover, all while horrifying audio play continued from the hidden speakers. He would play the sounds of his daughter weeping, of his wife begging, of tools being laid out on a metal tray. He would intersperse the terror with periods of silence that were some or worse, leaving Ethan to imagine the unspeakable horrors his own family was enduring in the next room. All because of him. The silence was a canvas, and Ethan's imagination painted it with his worst fears. The psychological warfare was insidious. The conductor would describe in calm, clinical detail what was supposedly happening to Anna and Lily. "You hear that sound?" he would ask gently as a high-pitched whine filled the room. "That is a dentorial. The incisors are particularly sensitive. You know." He would then apply a heated rod to Ethan's skin, forcing him to choose between his own scream and the imagined one of his child. He was being forced to participate, to become the arbiter of his family's agony, his every reaction a potential death sentence. His mind began to fray at the edges, the line between the room and his imagination blurring into a single, continuous nightmare. He lived for the moments of reprieve, the brief periods when the conductor would leave him alone in the gray silence. In those moments, he would whisper his wife's name, his daughter's name, apologies and promises into the unhearing walls. He clung to their faces in his mind, their smiles, the memory of their warmth. They were his anchor in a sea of pain and fear. But the recordings were relentless, chipping away at his sanity. He heard them call his name, asking why he was letting this happen, why he wasn't saving them. The love that was his shield was being reforged into a weapon, used against him with devastating precision. One session, as the conductor worked on his foot with a small, sharp blade, Ethan heard Anna scream his name, followed by a sickening, wet crack. But in the background, beneath the horror, he heard something else. A faint, tinny chime, the sound of a clock striking the hour. He knew that clock. It was the antique mantel clock from his wife's grandmother, the one they kept in their living room. But why would it be in a torch chamber? It was a detail that was too specific, too personal, and for the first time, a hairline crack appeared in the solid wall of his belief. It was a single, discordant note in an otherwise perfect symphony of terror. The doubt was a dangerous, fragile thing. Was it a trick, a flaw in the performance, or was his own mind, so stretched and battered, finally inventing things, creating false hope as a last defense before it shattered completely? He decided he had to know. He had to risk it. The next time the conductor began his work, applying the tool that sent waves of electric fire up his arm, he prepared himself. As the sound of Lily's frightened sobs filled the room, Ethan did the one thing he had sworn he would never do. He opened his mouth and screamed, a raw, ragged, and utterly defiant sound that tore from the depths of his soul. The effect was not what he expected. The recording of his daughter did not escalate into a scream of agony. It simply cut off. The room was plunged into an abrupt, deafening silence. The conductor froze, his hand still holding electrical device to Ethan's arm. For the first time since the ordeal began, the man's placid mask slipped. Just for a second, Ethan saw a flash of something in his eyes, not anger, but the pure, incandescent fury of an artist whose masterpiece has been deliberately flawed by a clumsy smudge. The illusion had been broken, and the architect of his suffering was furious. "You have ruined it," the conductor whispered, his voice losing its calm cadence, now laced with a venomous hiss. He stood up and kicked his stool over. It was a perfect composition, a symphony of sacrifice. He stalked to the wall and ripped away a gray panel, revealing a complex array of audio equipment, high-fidelity speakers, and racks of digital sound files. "There is no one in the next room." "You fool, there never was. It was all a recording. A performance." The art was not in the pain, but in the belief, in your noble, pointless, silent suffering. That was the beauty. The truth was 1,000 times more cruel than the lie. The physical pain was nothing. The real torture had been the hope, the belief that his agony had a purpose, that he was a shield for the people he loved. To have that ripped away was to have his soul hollowed out, was the sound of his daughter, Lily, laughing, the pure, innocent sound of her playing in their backyard. Ethan began to weep, deep, shuddering sobs that came from a place beyond pain. The sound of his daughter's joy was the most excruciating torture he had ever endured. The conductor played more. The sound of Anna humming as she cooked dinner. The sound of them watching a movie together. Their voices filled with warmth and love. He was showing Ethan everything he had been fighting for. Everything he had lost. A paradise he could hear but never, ever return to. He was a ghost. His mind, which had held so strong against the physical torment, now collapsed under the weight of this new, refined agony. The laughter from the speakers mingled with his own broken sobs, creating a horrifying, discordant duet. He was no longer fighting, no longer hoping. He was simply a vessel for a pain so profound it had erased the man he used to be. The gray room, which had been his prison, now became his world, and the sounds of his family's happiness became the soundtrack to his own private, eternal hell. He was an audience of one, forever watching a life he could no longer touch. The conductor watched, his anger replaced by a look of detached, academic satisfaction. He had failed to complete his symphony as planned, but the improvised finale was, he had to admit, a masterpiece in its own right. He had not just broken the man's body. He had not just broken his mind. He had successfully captured and contained a human soul in a perfect, closed loop of suffering. He made a few notes in a small leather-bound book, then began to quietly purse audio equipment. The performance was over. It was time to find a new stage. Dr. Elias Thorne was a man who worshipped at the altar of precision. As a reconstructive surgeon, his world was one of clean lines, sterile, and the miraculous, intricate art of joining flesh to flesh. His hands, steady and sure, could mend the most ravaged of bodies, suturing skin and grafting tissue, with the detached grace of a master craftsman. He saw the human form not as a vessel for a soul, but as a beautiful, complex machine, a puzzle he could solve and put back together. This obsession with control and perfection extended to his life, and most particularly, to his beautiful wife, Ilara, whom he considered his most flawless acquisition. Ilara, however, had grown to feel like a butterfly pinned under glass, her vibrant spirit suffocating in the sterile, ordered world Elias had built around her. She found her escape in the arms of another man, a painter named Julian, whose hands were stained with color and chaos, the very antithesis of her husband's. Their affair was a desperate, passionate secret, a splash of wild, unpredictable life in the gray, monochrome existence she shared with the surgeon. She knew the danger, felt the precariousness of her deception, but Julian's chaotic world was the only place she felt she could truly breathe. A welcome storm after years of unnerving calm. Elias was not a fool. He was a man trained to see the slightest asymmetry, the smallest deviation from the norm. He noticed the new, wild light in Ilara's eyes, the faint scent of turpentine that clung to her hair, the way her body, once a familiar landscape, now held a subtle, foreign tension. He did not confront her with accusations or rage. That was not his way. Instead, he observed. He collected data, his brilliant, analytical mind treating her infidelity not as a betrayal, but as a fascinating, complex new disease that required a radical and very precise surgical intervention. The confirmation of his suspicions did not break him, it galvanized him. He followed Ilara one evening to Julian's cluttered, paint-spattered studio and watched them through the window. Their bodies entwined, a messy, imperfect union of limb and passion. And in that moment, watching the two people who had shattered his perfect world, an idea of terrible, beautiful symmetry began to form in his mind. They wanted to be together, to be inseparable. He, Dr. Elias Thorne, the master of joining flesh, would grant them their wish. He would give them a union more profound, more absolute, and more permanent than they could ever have imagined in their wildest, most passionate dreams. His plan was executed with the same meticulous care he applied to a 12-hour skin graft. He used his knowledge of anesthetics to drug their wine at a gallery opening, a subtle, tasteless compound that would render them unconscious without a struggle. He transported them in the back of his van to his secluded country home, a place far from the prying eyes of the city. Down in the basement, behind a soundproofed steel door, was his private operating theater, a sterile, white room that was more advanced and better equipped than the one he used at the city's most prestigious hospital. It was his sanctuary, his workshop, and tonight, it would be his canvas. When Alara and Julian awoke, they found themselves not in each other's arms, but strapped to adjacent operating tables, the cold, bright lights of the surgical suite burning into their eyes. They were paralyzed from the neck down, as a result of a carefully administered spinal block, but their minds were terrifyingly, completely lucid. Elias stood between them, dressed in his surgical greens, his face obscured by a mask, only his eyes visible, gleaming with a calm, intellectual fervor. "I have always been a proponent of lasting bonds," he said, his voice a low, clinical hum. "Your connection is so powerful. I thought it deserved a more physical manifestation." He explained his procedure with the detached air of a professor giving a lecture. He would not kill them. Death was a messy, imprecise solution. Instead, he would join them. He would flay the skin from their adjacent sides, from shoulder to ankle, and suture them together. He would shave down their ribs and fuse their thoracic cages, break and reset their pelvic bones so they would heal as one. He would even reroute their circulatory systems, creating a shared, unified network. "You will be a living masterpiece of surgical art," he explained calmly, a testament to the concept of inseparability. "You will share every breath, every heartbeat, every single sensation for the rest of your lives." The horror of his words was a cold, sharp blade that sliced through their drug-induced haze. They could only watch, their eyes wide with a terror that had no voice, as he laid out his gleaming instruments. The rhythmic beat of the heart monitors was the only sound in the room, a steady, separate beat for each of them. Elias made the first incision on Julian's side, a long, clean cut, the red line a stark, brutal contrast to the sterile white of the room. Julian's monitor spiked, his silent, paralyzed scream echoing only in the frantic, terrified chambers of his own mind. Alara could only watch, knowing she was next. The surgery lasted for 36 hours. Elias worked without rest, fueled by a cold, focused rage and an artist's obsessive passion. He was no longer a healer. He was a creator, a mad god forging a new, terrible life form from the wreckage of his own. He worked with a terrifying tenderness, his hands moving with the same care he would use to reconstruct the face of a child. He was not mutilating them, in his twisted, brilliant mind. He was perfecting them, elevating their messy, transient affair into a permanent, undeniable, and inescapable state of being. The two separate heartbeats on the monitors slowly, over many hours, began to synchronize. When they awoke for the second time, the paralysis was gone, but a new, more profound imprisonment had taken its place. They were lying on their sides, facing each other, their bodies irrevocably joined. Alara could feel the warmth of Julian's blood mingling with her own, the rise and fall of his chest now an extension of her own breathing. She tried to pull away, a primal, instinctual act of revulsion, but the movement only resulted in a wave of shared, searing pain that tore through both of them. They were one. They were a single, two-headed, four-armed creature, a living, breathing monument to a surgeon's jealousy. Their new existence was a carefully curated hell. Elias kept them in a specially designed room in his basement, a sterile, white cell where he could observe his creation. He fed them, bathed them, and cared for them with the detached diligence of a researcher tending to a prized specimen. He documented their every reaction, their shared pain, their clumsy, agonizing attempts to coordinate their movements, the way they would sometimes weep in perfect, horrified unison. He was fascinated by the psychological toll of their forced intimacy, the way their individual identities began to fray and bleed into one another. They could never escape each other's presence. Every sensation was shared. When one felt a pang of hunger, the other's stomach would rumble. When one had a nightmare, the other would awaken in a cold sweat. They were trapped in perpetual, inescapable conversation, their thoughts and feelings no longer their own. They could not even grant each other the small mercy of turning away. They were forced to forever gaze into the eyes of the person who was both their lover and the living symbol of their eternal, shared damnation. A prison made of their own flesh and bone. Their love, once a passionate, liberating force, curdled into a toxic, claustrophobic hatred. They blamed each other, their silent arguments raging in the space between their faces. But their hatred was a shared thing, too, another bond that fused them together. They were a self-devouring entity, two souls trapped in a single, monstrous body, their shared existence a continuous, unbroken scream that no one but the other could ever hear. They were a perfect, symmetrical, and eternal punishment, and their creator would often come to visit, to simply sit and admire the terrible, beautiful precision of his work. Elias would sit in a chair just out of their reach, a glass of wine in his hand, and simply watch them. He felt no remorse, no guilt, only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a problem perfectly solved. He had taken something broken, something asymmetrical and chaotic, and he had fixed it. He had created a perfect, lasting union. He had made them inseparable, and in the dead of night, when the old house was silent, the only sound that could be heard from the basement was the soft, rhythmic, and perfectly synchronized sound of two hearts, beating as one. The final horror was the realization that they were beginning to forget where one of them ended, and the other began. Their thoughts would sometimes overlap, a shared memory of a life that belonged to neither of them. They would have the same dream, fleeting, beautiful dream of running alone through an open field, only to wake up to the terrible, familiar reality of their shared flesh. Elias had not just joined their bodies. He was, with each passing day, suturing their very souls together, creating a single, new consciousness born from the ashes of two destroyed lives. A singular, lonely God in a prison of his own making. Julian Vance lived a life painted in warm, sunlit colors. His career as an architect was a series of quiet triumphs, his designs lauded for their clean lines and gentle harmony. His home, one of his own creations, was a sanctuary of glass and cedar, a space he shared with his wife, Clara, whose laughter was the true foundation of the house. Their love was an easy, comfortable thing, a masterpiece of shared jokes and quiet understanding. In the periphery of this perfect picture was Thomas Reed, a junior draftsman at Julian's firm, a man made of quiet grays and sharp, unnoticed angles, who watched Julian's effortless success with a silent, corrosive envy that was slowly calcifying his soul. Thomas did not just envy Julian, he studied him with the meticulous, obsessive focus of a scholar preparing for his final, life-altering exam. He learned the cadence of Julian's voice, the specific way he would pause before making a point in a meeting. He memorized the lazy, confident loop of Julian's signature, practicing it for hours until it was an identical echo of the original. He sat in cafes across from Julian's favorite lunch spot, watching the way he held his fork, the way he smiled at Clara when she met him. He was not just an admirer of the art, he was a forger, preparing to create a perfect, living counterfeit of a man. The first phase of the replacement was an act of digital haunting. Thomas, a phantom in the firm's network, began his work with subtle, surgical strikes. An important client email from Julian would arrive in its recipient's spam folder. A crucial meeting on his calendar would be shifted by an hour. A key blueprint file would become momentarily corrupted just before a presentation. These were minor, isolated incidents, easily dismissed as technical glitches or human error. But they were the first, carefully laid stones in a path designed to lead Julian towards a reputation of being unreliable, forgetful, and slowly, quietly, incompetent. With Julian's professional life beginning to fray at the edges, Thomas turned his attention to the domestic front. He began a campaign of subtle, psychological warfare against Clara's peace of mind. A hang-up call to the house landline in the middle of the night. A florist delivery of a single, funereal lily with no card. He even created a fake social media profile, a woman who would occasionally like one of Julian's old photos, a digital ghost designed to plant the smallest, most poisonous seed of doubt in Clara's mind. He was not trying to break them apart, but merely to introduce a subtle, constant static into the clear channel of their trust. Julian felt his perfect world beginning to tilt on its axis. He was working harder than ever, yet his projects were falling behind. He was devoted to Clara, yet he could feel a new, uncharacteristic tension coiling in the spaces between them. He became a man haunted by 1,000 tiny failures, a series of unfortunate coincidences that were slowly eroding his confidence and his sanity. His friends noticed his distraction. His boss commented on his lack of focus. He was being slowly, methodically isolated, not by walls, but by the quiet, collective doubt of everyone he had ever known. The psychological assault was mirrored by a slow, chilling physical transformation. Thomas began to sculpt himself into Julian's image. He adopted the same brand of cologne, a subtle scent that now followed him like a lie. He had his hair cut and styled by Julian's barber, showing a secretly snapped photo to get the exact look. He even underwent a painful, expensive dental procedure to have a small, distinctive chip on his front tooth replicated. He was shedding his skin, layer by layer, and replacing it with a stolen identity, becoming a living echo of the man he was preparing to erase. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday. Julian, leaving work late, saw his own reflection in the dark glass of the office lobby. But the reflection was walking on the other side of the street, wearing his coat, carrying his Bermuda briefcase, worth of paranoia and fear. Thomas simply looked at him with a calm, pitying expression, and said, "Julian, are you feeling all right? You look terrible." That night, the plan entered its final, irreversible stage. As Julian entered his garage, a figure emerged from the shadows. Before he could react, a cloth soaked in a sweet, cloying chemical was pressed over his. His last conscious thought was one of profound, soul-crushing confusion. He awoke in a place that was both familiar and a complete nightmare. It was a perfect, soundproofed replica of his own study, but with one key difference: the single, large window was not glass, but a bank of high-definition monitors, and on them, he saw his own house, his own life, playing out in real time. Thomas Reed walked through the front door of the glass and cedar house, not as himself, but as a ghost made flesh. He called out Julian's customary greeting, his voice a perfect, practiced imitation. Clara emerged from the kitchen, a worried expression on her face. "Julian, you're so late. I was worried." He smiled. Julian's smile used a pet name only Julian would know. A piece of intimate data he had extracted from Julian's personal emails. He explained his lateness with a fabricated story about a difficult client, a lie that was smoother and more convincing than any truth Julian could have offered. Julian's new existence was a waking hell, a torture of 1,000 cuts. He was strapped to a chair, a silent, unwilling audience to his own life. Thomas, through an intercom, would demand information, force Julian to divulge the intimate details that made his life his own. The name of his childhood dog, the story of his first date with Clara, the private fears he had only ever confessed to his wife. Each memory he surrendered was another piece of himself that he was feeding to the monster who had stolen his world. Another brushstroke on the living counterfeit. The most horrifying part was that Thomas was a better Julian than he had ever been. He was more attentive to Clara, remembering anniversaries and small, forgotten preferences that the real, stressed Julian had let slip. He was more decisive and charismatic at work, closing deals and winning praise from the same partners who had been doubting Julian just weeks before. The world had not just accepted the replacement, it had embraced him. Julian was forced to watch as his life, now in the hands of a sociopath, became more perfect than it had ever been with him in it. Clara, however, began to feel a strange, indefinable dissonance. The man who shared her bed was perfect, but his perfection was unsettling. He never had a bad day. He never forgot to take out the trash. He remembered every detail of every conversation they had ever had. One night, he told her a story about their honeymoon, but he got one small, crucial detail wrong. A private joke that he recounted with the sterile accuracy of a man reciting a fact from a textbook. It was a single, wrong note in a flawless symphony, and it was enough to awaken a deep, primal sense of wrongness. From his prison, Julian had one weapon left, a shared past. He knew the house's electrical system, the one he had designed himself, had a flaw. By rhythmically banging his head against a specific point on the wall, he could create a minute power surge, just enough to cause the kitchen lights to flicker. He began to tap out a message, a simple, desperate rhythm, the Morse code for SOS, a pattern they had learned as a joke years ago after watching a submarine movie. It was a faint, desperate signal from a man who no longer officially existed. The flickering began. At first, Clara dismissed it as faulty wiring, but then she recognized the pattern, the long-forgotten rhythm from a silly, romantic evening, the single wrong note of the honeymoon story, then settling perfection. The flickering lights had all coalesced into a terrifying, impossible conclusion. The man in her house was not her husband. She was living with an imposter, a stranger who knew every secret of her life. Sanctuary had become a cage, and she was sharing it with the monster who had taken her love. That night, she waited until he was asleep. With trembling hands, she went through his briefcase, a place the real Julian, a man who valued his privacy, would have never let her touch. She didn't know what she was looking for, but she found it tucked into a hidden pocket, a worn, dog-eared driver's license. The photo was of the man sleeping in her bed, but the name was not Julian Vance. It was Thomas Reed. The truth was now a cold, hard piece of plastic in her hand. She looked from the license to the bedroom door, her heart a frantic, trapped bird, and wondered what the monster would do when it woke up and realized she knew. Detective Kalen K. Reyes thought he had seen every possible method of desecrating the human form that the city's dark heart could conceive. He was a connoisseur of carnage, a veteran of 1,000 gruesome tableaus. Yet, the sight in the Grand Plaza froze the marrow in his bones. Before him, placed perfectly in the center of the fountain, was a statue. It depicted a man on his knees, hands clasped to his face, his features a perfect mask of abject terror. It was rendered in a pristine, milky wax, so lifelike that Carrie could see the individual pores on the skin, the delicate terror creases around the eyes. It was a masterpiece of photorealistic sculpture, a monument to a single, final moment of horror. The initial reports had called it a guerrilla art installation, a provocative statement by some unknown artist. But as the forensics team worked under the cold morning light, a far more sinister reality began to emerge. The medical examiner, a woman named Esla, who was as unflappable as Kay, made the call with a voice strained by disbelief. The statue wasn't solid wax. Using a thermal scanner, she had found a core of denser, warmer material. With painstaking care, she made a small, deep incision at the base. Beneath the inch-thick layer of wax was not plaster or wire, but the unmistakable texture of cooked human tissue. The statue was not a sculpture, it was a sarcophagus. The victim was a hedge fund manager, a man whose reputation for ruthless corporate raiding was legendary. He had vanished 2 nights prior. The autopsy revealed the true, unspeakable horror of his death. He had been submerged in a vat of boiling paraffin wax, the thermal shock stopping his heart almost instantly, but not before the molten liquid had poured down his throat, filling his lungs, and cooking him from the inside out. He had been purified in the most absolute and agonizing way imaginable, his final, terrified pose immortalized as the wax cooled around him, creating a perfect, seamless mold of his last moments. Panic, a cold and greasy thing, began to seep into the city's consciousness. This was not a crime of passion or greed. It was a ritual, a statement. The killer, or killers, were artists of a terrifying new medium. A week later, a second statue appeared, this time on the steps of City Hall. It was a woman, a well-known socialite famous for her scandalous affairs, her body arched backward in a pose of excruciating agony, her silent scream sealed forever in white wax. The city's elite, the powerful and the corrupt, began to look over their shoulders, wondering if their own sins would make them the next canvas for this silent, horrifying sculptor. Kay found the only clue on the second victim, etched into the wax behind her ear, almost invisible, was a small, elegant symbol, a single flame inside a perfect circle. He took it to a university historian, a man who specialized in the city's forgotten fringe movements. The old professor's hands trembled as he looked at the symbol. He spoke of a doomsday cult from a century ago, the acolytes of the cleansing flame. They believed the world was irredeemably corrupt and that only creating beacons of purity, statues of the wicked, encased in wax, could they hold back a tide of divine, apocalyptic wrath. The cult had supposedly vanished after a fire destroyed their hidden temple. The historian explained their doctrine: the wax, made from the purest beeswax and blessed in secret rites, was a holy substance. The boiling immersion was a baptism of fire and water, a violent act of purification that burned away the soul's sins while preserving the body as a testament to that sin. The victims were not just murdered, they were being transformed into sacred objects, their bodies becoming unwilling prayers against the end of the world. Kay realized he was not hunting a simple killer, the resurrected ghost of a fanatical, century-old faith, a faith that saw murder as a holy, artistic act. A break came from an unlikely source. A chemical analysis of the wax revealed trace amounts of a specific, rare floral pollen, native only to a small, protected valley upstate where a reclusive monastic order maintained an apiary. The order had no record of selling large quantities of beeswax to anyone, but one of the younger monks recalled an odd purchase years ago. A quiet, well-dressed man had bought their entire stock, claiming it was for a large-scale art project. He had paid cash and arranged for his own transport. The monk remembered the name on the invoice: the Lumen Foundation. The Lumen Foundation was a registered charity, a front with a vague mission statement about urban beautification and community art. Its registered address led Kay to a decommissioned soap factory in the city's decaying industrial zone. From the outside, it was a derelict brick husk. But inside, it was a temple. The main factory floor had been converted into a pristine white gallery, silent and cold, and in the gallery stood the rest of their congregation. Dozens of wax statues, men and women of all ages, stood on pedestals in a silent, ghostly crowd, each one a perfect, horrifying snapshot of a soul's final second. He was not alone. From the shadows between the statues, they emerged. They were dressed in simple, white artisans' smocks, their faces calm and serene. They were not the wild-eyed fanatics he had expected. They were quiet, focused artists. Their leader, a man with the gentle eyes of a poet and the steady hands of a surgeon, stepped forward. "Detective," he said, his voice soft and resonant. "Welcome to the gallery. We are glad you appreciate our work. We feared the world had lost its eye for true, meaningful art." The leader gestured to the silent figures. "We do not hate these people, Detective. We pity them. They are drowning in the filth of their own lives. We simply offer them a final, lasting absolution. We give their fleeting, corruptible existence a permanent, pure form. We turn their ugly, messy lives into a beautiful, silent warning. It is a terrible, sacred duty. It is our art, and it is our prayer." He looked at Kay with a profound, unnerving sense of understanding, as if he could see every compromise Kay had ever made, every small corruption he had overlooked in the name of justice. "Our collection is almost complete," the leader continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We have beacons of greed, of lust, of deceit, but we are missing a crucial piece, a representation of corrupt justice, a figure who wades through the city's sin every day, who becomes stained by it, who is forced to look away from the rot to preserve the facade of order." His eyes, full of a terrifying, artistic zeal, were fixed. "Kay, we need a statue of a good man who has been forced to compromise his soul to fight monsters." Kay felt a sudden, sharp prick in his neck. His vision began to swim, the pristine white gallery blurring at the edges. The acolytes were closing in, their movements slow and deliberate, like priests preparing a sacrifice. He could hear the low, bubbling hiss of a large, heated vat from a room deeper within the factory. The sweet, cloying scent of melting beeswax filled the air, thick and suffocating. He saw an empty pedestal in the center of the room, its marble surface gleaming under the gallery lights, waiting for the collection's final, crowning piece. His legs gave way, and the cultists caught him, their hands surprisingly gentle as they lowered him onto a gurney. As they wheeled him toward the bubbling vat, the leader leaned in close, his breath warm against TA's ear. "Do not be afraid, Detective," he whispered, his voice filled with a holy, artistic passion. "Your final pose will be a masterpiece. a perfect, silent scream against the injustice of the world. You will be our most beautiful. Mba's Iwakai's last conscious thought was of the immense, searing heat, and the terrible, purifying light of the cleansing flame. The next morning, a new statue appeared in the city. Placed directly in front of the police headquarters, it was a figure of a man in a trench coat, his hand reaching for a gun that wasn't there, his face a perfect, waxen mask of shock, defiance, and ultimate, agonizing resignation. The city looked upon the new work of art, and for the first time, in the face of this silent, waxen officer, it began to truly understand the meanings to bear. The gallery was complete, and the prayers had been answered. The final paragraph now describes the last statue, that of the detective, appearing in front of the police headquarters. It stands as the final piece in the cult's collection, a silent testament to their horrifying work, leaving the city to contemplate the chilling meaning behind this final, perfect act of purification. David's hands, usually steady and precise, trembled as he placed the final, minuscule roof shingle. For over a year, his workshop had been a bold sanctuary, a world of balsa wood, miniature bricks, and painstaking detail. He was not merely building a dollhouse, he was recreating his own home, a perfect 1112 scale replica of the Victorian house where his family lived. Every detail was perfect, from the tiny, hand-painted books on the study shelves to the faint, intentional water stain on the ceiling of the guest bedroom. It was a monument to his life, a testament to his craft, and the ultimate gift for his daughter. His wife, Clara, and Lily marveled at the finished creation. It was a perfect, silent echo of their own world, a house within a house. David's final touch was to create the inhabitants tiny, posable dolls with yarn hair and painted faces, each one a miniature effigy of himself. Clara and Lily, he placed them in the miniature living room, their tiny forms frozen in a scene of domestic bliss. The dollhouse was the centerpiece of the home, a charming, if slightly obsessive, testament to a father's love. It sat in the corner of the real living room, a quiet, watching twin, the first thread in the fabric of their reality unraveled on a Tuesday. While dusting the workshop, David clumsily knocked the dollhouse, and the tiny figure of Clara toppled from her miniature armchair, landing awkwardly on the polished wooden floor of the tiny kitchen. At that exact moment, a sharp cry of pain echoed from the real kitchen. He rushed in to find Clara on the floor, her face pale and contorted in agony, her ankle twisted at an impossible angle. "I tripped," she gasped. Over nothing. They dismissed it as a shocking, unnerving coincidence, a bizarre fluke of timing that sent a shiver down David's spine. That night, David could not sleep. He sat before the dollhouse, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. The pride he had felt was curdling into a nascent, formless fear. He picked up the tiny Clara doll, a painted smile seeming to mock him, and placed it carefully back in its chair. He tried to rationalize the event, to explain it away with logic and probability, but the perfect, cruel symmetry of the accident was a splinter in his mind. The miniature world he had so lovingly crafted was no longer a charming toy. It had become an object of profound and terrible suspicion. A week passed, the incident fading into the background of their lives, but the doubt festered in David's mind like a hidden sickness. He had to know, with a trembling hand and a heart hammering against his ribs. He devised a small, cruel experiment. He took a bottle of crimson paint, the same he'd used for the miniature roses in the garden, and dipped a pin into it. He then made a tiny, almost invisible scratch on the arm of the Lily doll. He held his breath, watching his daughter as she played on the lawn outside, his stomach churning with a mixture of hope and terror. Then he saw it. A thin red line appeared on Lily's arm, a bead of blood welling up from an inexplicable wound. The world tilted on its axis. The workshop, once his sanctuary, now felt like a profane chapel where he had unwittingly performed a dark and binding ritual. He had created a sympathetic link, a voodoo effigy of his own home family. His first, frantic impulse was to destroy it, to smash the delicate structure into 1,000 pieces and burn the remains until nothing was left but ash. But a paralyzing fear stayed his hand. If a fallen doll could break a wrinkle, what cataclysm would the destruction of the entire house unleash upon his family? He was trapped. the creator held hostage by his own perfect, terrible creation. His obsession shifted from creation to preservation. The dollhouse became the focus of his every waking moment, a fragile vessel containing the well-being of his family. He became a nervous, unseen god to the miniature world, carefully arranging the dolls in the safest possible positions, away from tiny staircases or sharp-edged furniture. He checked for loose floorboards and secured miniature windows, his days consumed by a frantic, secret maintenance. His family saw only its growing eccentricity, his strange new rituals, and the haunted look that had taken permanent residence in his eyes. They did not understand that he was no longer a hobbyist. He was a warden. Then, the house began to assert its own will. One morning, David discovered a tiny, black smudge marring the wallpaper in the miniature living room. A blemish he was certain he had not made. A cold dread washed over him as he rushed downstairs. There, in the exact same spot on the real living room wall, a patch of ugly, black mold was blooming, a creeping stain of decay that had not been there the night before. The dollhouse was no longer a passive mirror of their reality. It was becoming the source, a malevolent blueprint for the decay of his home. The incidents grew more frequent, the miniature world seeding disasters in the real one. A tiny crack appeared in a dollhouse window pane, and an hour later, the corresponding window in the real house shattered without cause, spraying glass through across the floor. The faucet in the miniature bathroom began to drip, a single, perfect bead of clear resin forming at its tip, and that night a pipe burst in their real bathroom, flooding the upstairs hallway. David was no longer a guardian. He was a servant, locked in a constant, desperate battle against the miniature house's slow, deliberate entropy. His family's concern curdled into frustration. His constant, frantic tinkering, his muttered curses at the tiny, inanimate objects. His refusal to leave the house for more than an hour, it was tearing them apart. Clara found him one night in his workshop, his face illuminated by a single lamp, meticulously regluing a tiny roof shingle that had come loose. She pleaded with him, her voice strained with worry, telling him his obsession was becoming a sickness, that he needed help. He tried to explain, to make her understand the terrible truth, but the words sounded like the ravings of a madman, and he saw only pity and fear in her eyes. One evening, something new appeared in the dollhouse. It was a figure, no larger than his thumb, standing in the shadowed corner of Lily's miniature bedroom. It was not one of his creations. It was a solid black shape, a void in the shape of a man, featureless and utterly alien. A cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeped into the room. He ran upstairs to check on his daughter. He found her asleep, but her room was unnaturally frigid, and she was shivering violently beneath her blankets, her face pale and slick with a cold sweat. The shadow in the dollhouse began to move. Each morning, David would find it in a new position, a few millimeters closer to the tiny bed where the Lily doll lay. In the real world, his daughter's health began to fail. She was plagued by terrible nightmares, waking up screaming about a shadow man who watched her from the corner of her room. The doctors were baffled, finding no physical cause for her rapid decline. David knew, with a certainty that was eating him alive, that the entity in the house was a parasite, and it was feeding on his daughter's life. He knew he had to break the connection, to sever the supernatural wires that bound the two houses together. He couldn't risk destroying the dollhouse, but perhaps he could prove the link, prove to himself that he wasn't insane, and in doing so, find a way to fight back. In a final, desperate act of self-mutilation, he took the tiny doll of himself from the workshop. With a choked sob, he gripped its tiny leg and snapped the balsa wood in two. The sound was insignificant, but the pain that erupted in his own leg was a supernova of agony. He collapsed, screaming, as he felt his own tibia break with a sickening, audible crack, lying on the floor of his workshop, his leg shattered and his mind reeling in agony. David dragged himself to the doorway to look at the dollhouse. His horrified gaze fell upon Lily's miniature bedroom. The tiny shadow figure was no longer in the corner. It was standing beside the bed, its formless, dark shape leaning over the sleeping Lily doll. It reached out a thin, wispy arm and placed its hand upon the doll's head. From his daughter's room upstairs, he heard a single, faint cry. a sound of surprise and fear that was abruptly cut short, replaced by a profound and terrifying silence. The silence was the most horrible sound he had ever heard. It was the sound of an ending. He tried to crawl, to scream, to do anything, but he was broken, a prisoner in his own body. He could only lie there, weeping, as the silence from his daughter's room stretched into an eternal, unbreachable void. The miniature house sat in the living room, perfectly still, its work now done. He, its creator, was left as last broken witness to its quiet, patient, and absolute victory, a king of a ruined kingdom, a father with nothing left to protect. Maple Street was a quiet graveyard of lost companions. Every telephone pole was a tombstone, layered with the faded, sun-bleached faces of missing pets. "Have you seen Patches, buddy? Come home." The pleas, written in the hopeful scrawl of children and the shaky hands of the elderly, were a permanent part of neighborhood's landscape. For years, animals had vanished without a trace, a slow, silent exodus that the residents had sadly accepted as a grim fact of life. Old Mr. Abernathy was the latest to join the bereaved. His gin cat, Marmalade, had disappeared 3 nights ago, leaving behind only a half-full food bowl and a crushing, house-sized silence. It was in that silence that the new sounds began. On the first night, Abernathy heard a faint scratching at his back door, but when he looked, there was nothing but the wind-strewn leaves of autumn. On the second night, the scratching was joined by a low, confused noise, a sound that was not quite a bark, not quite a meow, but a strange, guttural fusion of the two. He dismissed it as a raccoon, but a seed of unease was planted in the barren soil of his grief. The sounds were a violation, a wrong note in the familiar symphony of the night, a discordant echo of the life that had been stolen from him. On the third night, the sound was louder, more complex. It was a chorus of suffering, a tapestry of animal noises woven into a single, monstrous voice. He could distinguish the frantic chirping of a parakeet, the deep whir of a retriever, and the high-pitched yowl of a Siamese cat, all emanating from one spot just beyond his patio light. He crept to the window, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. In the hazy penumbra, he saw a shape, large and low to the ground, a heaving mass of shadow that seemed to drink the light around it. It was formless and shifting, and as he watched, a single, canine leg detached from the bulk and took a hesitant step before being reabsorbed. Sleep offered no escape. He dreamt of Marmalade, but his beloved cat was wrong. His fur matted with feathers and patches of snakeskin, his purr a distorted rumble that contained the whimper of a dog. He awoke in a cold sweat, phantom feeling of a wet, canine nose pressing against his hand. He went to the kitchen for a glass of water and found a gift on his doormat. It was a small, tattered blue collar, the bell still attached. He recognized instantly it had belonged to Buddy, the golden retriever from 2 houses down who had vanished last spring. The collar was covered in a strange, sticky ectoplasm that smelled of wet fur, birdseed, and something else, something metallic and wrong. The disappearances were not random acts of cruelty or predation. Abernathy began to understand, with a certainty that defied all logic, that they were a form of collection. He spent the day walking Maple Street, really looking at the flyers the first time. Patches the calico, Pip the parakeet, Buster the beagle, Shelley the tortoise. He saw them not as individual tragedies, but as a list of ingredients. The sounds, the shifting shape, this collar, it was all part of a single, horrifying equation. Something was gathering the neighborhood's lost love, its forgotten companions, and assembling them into a new, unholy whole. That night, he did not wait for it to come to him. Armed with a heavy, 4-cell flashlight, he went outside, his fear a cold, sharp blade in his gut. He followed the wet, multi-pawed tracks it had left on the pavement, a trail that led him to the old, abandoned playground at the end of the cul-de-sac. The rusted swing set groaned in the wind, a lonely, rhythmic cry. He swept the beam of his flashlight across the sandbox and the light landed on the creature. It was huddled beneath the slide, a quivering, composite beast of fur, feather, and scale, a living, breathing monument to loss. It was larger than he had imagined, the size of a small bear, dozens of eyes, feline, canine, and avian, blinked in the sudden, harsh light. A single, feathered wing twitched spasmodically from flank of matted, calico fur. A tortoise's head, its ancient eyes blinking slowly, extended from the creature's side before retracting. It was a chaotic, writhing amalgam of all the pets from the faded flyers, their form of hues together in a biological nightmare. It was not a predator that had eaten the missing animals. It was the missing animals, all of them, trapped in a single, shared body. The creature made a noise, a soft, pleading sound that was a perfect imitation of Marmalade's familiar meow. A single, ginger-furred paw, unmistakably his cat's, extended from the heaving mass, its claws kneading the air, in a gesture of contentment he had seen 1,000 times. This was the true horror. This monster was not a thing of hate, but of a desperate, confused love. It was the collective consciousness of every loyal companion that had ever lost, every pet that had ever tried to find its way home. Their instincts and affections now hopelessly entangled. It began to move towards him, a lurching, uneven gait propelled by a dozen mismatched legs. It was not an attack. It was a homecoming. It recognized him. The part of it that was Marmalade. The part that was Buddy. The part that was every pet he had ever patted on the head as he walked down the street. Knew him. It wanted what every pet wants, the comfort of its master. The warmth of a familiar hand. The feeling of belonging. It was coming home. And it wanted to bring him into the fold. To make him a permanent part of its lonely, collective family. Abernathy was frozen, caught between the instinct to flee and the heartbreaking sight of his own cat's paw reaching for him from the body of a monster. The creature was close now, the smell of it overwhelming, a thick, cloying scent of a dozen different animals. It lowered what passed for its head, a lumpy, multi-eyed mass, and tried to nuzzle against his leg. He could feel the wetness of a dog's nose, the rough texture of a cat's tongue, and the cold smoothness of a reptile's scales, all at once. It was an embrace of pure, unadulterated horror. The part of it that was Marmalade began to purr, a deep, resonant vibration that Abernathy could feel in his bones. But the purr was wrong, interwoven with the frantic whimpers of a terrified dog and the hiss of a snake. The creature opened a mouth, a canine jaw that opened too wide, and from it came a sound that was not animal at all. It was the clear, synthesized voice of a child's talking parrot, a toy it must have absorbed from some home. Wannabe friend, it squawked. The cheerful, electronic voice a grotesque counterpoint to the monstrous form it came from. That sound broke the spell. Abernathy screamed, a raw, ragged sound of a man whose heart had just been irrevocably broken. He scrambled backwards, falling to the ground, and Crab walked away from the creature's pleading, "Advance." It stopped, its many eyes blinking in confusion. A low, sorrowful moan rising from its composite throat. It did not understand the rejection. It had brought all the love it contained, all the loyalty of 100 different pets, and offered it to him, and he had thrown it back in its face. He ran, his legs pumping, his lungs burning, not stopping until he was behind the locked door of his own home. He collapsed against it, his body shaking uncontrollably. The sound started again outside his door. The scratching, the whimpering, the confused, multi-voiced plea. It was not the sound of a monster trying to get in. It was the sound of a pet, locked out in the cold, begging to be let inside. He knew it would bear every night, a constant, loving, and monstrous reminder of what he had lost. He now lives as a prisoner in his own home. The windows and doors always locked. He never goes outside after dark. The flyers on the telephone poles continue to multiply, new faces joining the old. Each new poster is a fresh wave of grief. Abernathy, because he knows that the lost are not truly lost. They have just gone home, to the lonely, beating, and ever-growing heart of the neighborhood. A grotesque and loving monster that forever wanders the quiet, tree-lined streets, just wanting to be loved. He sometimes sees it from his window, a shambling shadow moving from yard to yard, leaving a small, sad gift on a doorstep, a chewed-up ball, a frayed piece of rope. It is a creature made of pure, unconditional love, twisted by some unknown law of nature into a thing of absolute terror. It is the guardian of Maple Street, the keeper of all its lost affection, and it is always watching, always waiting, with 100 pairs of sad, loyal eyes, for an owner who will never, ever let it in. Dr. Elias Vance was a name spoken only in the hushed, disgraced corners of the medical world. Once a neurosurgical prodigy, his obsession with the transference of consciousness had led him down a path of unethical experimentation that saw him stripped of his license and cast out from the scientific community. But Vance did not see his work as a transgression. He saw it as a sacred duty. He believed the body was a flawed, disposable vessel, a cage of decaying flesh that imprisoned the pure essence of the mind. In the sterile, soundproofed operating theater he had built beneath his secluded estate, he was not merely a doctor, he was a liberator, preparing to shatter the final barrier between life and death. His subject, a young, healthy man named Ben, had been chosen with the meticulous care of a connoisseur selecting a fine wine. Ben had been a drifter, a man without connections, a ghost in the system whose disappearance would go unnoticed. He awoke from a drugged haze to the soft, rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor and the cold, unforgiving glare of a surgical lamp. He was strapped to an operating table, his body scrubbed and prepped. Before him, moving with a calm, unnerving grace, was Dr. Vance, his face obscured by a surgical mask, his eyes holding the cold, detached curiosity of a man looking not at another human being, but at a piece of high-quality equipment. "Please, do not be alarmed," Vance said, his voice a smooth, placating baritone that did nothing to soothe the terror blooming in Ben's chest. "You are not a victim. You are a pioneer. You are about to become a vessel for the greatest medical leap in human history. Your body, so full of vitality, will provide the foundation for a new life. You are a sacrifice. Yes, but your contribution will echo for eternity. You are giving a gift of unparalleled significance, a healthy shell for a brilliant mind that is currently trapped in a failing one. Think of it as a donation of the highest order." Ben's frantic struggles were useless against the thick leather restraints. His pleas were absorbed by the soundproofed walls, unheard by anyone but the architect of his nightmare. Vance ignored the panic, continuing his lecture as he adjusted dials, checked readings on the humming machinery that surrounded the table. "The spinal cord, you see, is not a barrier, but a bridge," he explained, as if to a student. "The self is not in the heart or the limbs. It is a symphony of electrical impulses in the brain. I am merely going to provide the orchestra with a new, more robust concert hall. A simple matter of engineering, really." Through a reinforced glass window in the adjoining room, Ben could see the source of Vance's obsession. A woman lay on a hospital bed, her body frail and emaciated, kept alive by a web of tubes and wires. Her eyes were open, intelligent, and full of a desperate, pleading hope as she watched them. This was Eleanor, Vance's wife, a genius physicist whose mind was being slowly extinguished by a degenerative neurological disease. Vance wasn't just chasing scientific glory, he was fighting a deeply personal war against mortality Nassif, using Ben as his unwilling soldier and battlefield. The days leading up to the procedure were a form of refined, psychological torture. Vance would talk to Ben for hours, not as a person, but as a biological system. He would discuss the quality of Ben's muscle tone, the efficiency of his cardiovascular system, the perfect health of his organs. He was taking inventory, cataloging the assets of the body he was about to expropriate. Ben was forced to listen, as the man who was going to kill him praised the vessel he would leave behind, his identity slowly being stripped away until he felt like nothing more than a collection of valuable, soon-to-be vacant parts. Vance showed him the failures. In a chilled side room, floating in large cylinders of formaldehyde, were the grotesque results of his previous attempts. Twisted amalgams of animal parts, creatures with two heads stitched together in a silent, eternal scream. They were monstrous testaments to a decade of relentless, single-minded pursuit, crude preliminary trials. Vance explained without a hint of remorse. Necessary steps. Every great cathedral required a foundation of countless, unseen stones. These were my stones. But you, Ben, you are to be the spire, the final, perfect piece. The morning of the surgery arrived with a chilling sense of finality. The operating theater was a hive of automated activity. Robotic arms, polished to a mirror sheen, descended from the ceiling, their multi-jointed limbs ending in an array of terrifyingly precise instruments, saws, clamps, and scalpels. Vance stood at a master control panel, a conductor preparing to lead his mechanical orchestra in a symphony of separation and reattachment. Ben watched, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, as a second operating table was wheeled into the room and placed parallel to his own. Eleanor was brought in, her frail body almost lost in the sterile white sheets. She looked at Ben, and her eyes, the only part of her that could still move with purpose, conveyed a universe of apology and desperate self-need. She was a prisoner begging for the key, even knowing that the key was another man's life. Vance leaned down and kissed his wife's forehead. "Soon, my love," he whispered. "Soon you will walk again. You feel the sun, I promise." It was a vow made between a madman and his muse, a promise to be fulfilled with stolen flesh and blood. As a robotic arm descended with a syringe of anesthetic, Vance made his final address to Ben. "I want you to know that I do not hate you," he said, his voice holding a tone of genuine, detached sincerity. "In fact, I am grateful. Your anonymity was a gift. Your health is a miracle. Your body will allow my Eleanor to live again, to finish her work, to change the world. Your consciousness, I'm afraid, is simply unfortunate, but necessary, casualty of progress, a footnote in the annals of history. Please try to understand." The needle slid into Ben's arm, and a cold, heavy numbness began to creep through his veins. His last sensation was the high-frequency hum of a bone saw beginning to spin. His vision blurred, the bright surgical light fracturing into a kaleidoscope of fading stars. His final thought was not of anger or fear, but of a profound, crushed throe for the life he had never truly lived. A life that was now being unceremoniously unplugged, his body repurposed as a spare part in someone else's love story. The darkness that took him was absolute, silent, dreamless void. He was a house that had just been emptied, its lights turned off for the last time. Consciousness returned not as a gentle dawn, but as a violent, chaotic explosion. Cacophony of warring thoughts and sensations, two sets of memories, two identities, crashed against each other like tidal waves in the confines of a single skull. Ben's terror and Eleanor's hope. Ben's memories of dusty roads, and Eleanor's of complex equations. The body, Ben's body, lay on the table, but the mind within was a battlefield, a place unspeakable, dualistic agony. The symphony Vance had imagined was a shrieking, discordant mess of noise. Vance, ever the scientist, held up a mirror to the face on the table. Ben's face stared back, but the eyes were a terrifying spectacle. One eye, Ben's eye, was wide with a primal, uncomprehending horror. The other, Eleanor's, was filled with a dawning, intelligent despair. The scream tore from the throat, but it was a horrifying duet of two voices, a man's terrified roar and a woman's grief-stricken wail, both erupting from the same mouth. The body began to convulse, a puppet being torn apart by two warring masters pulling the strings in opposite directions. The procedure had not been a transplant, it had been a collision. Vance had not transferred a consciousness, he had superimposed one upon another, trapping them both in a single, shared hell. He had not created a new life, he had engineered a new and unique form of eternal torment. The creature on the table was not his wife reborn, nor was it the man he had sacrificed. It was something else entirely, a living paradox, a conscious nightmare that could never find peace. Its ever-aching moment, a war for control of a body that belonged to both and neither of them. Dr. Vance looked upon his creation, his face not one of horror, but of intense, analytical fascination. He had failed to save his wife, but he had succeeded in creating something the world had never seen. He picked up his data slate, his hands steady, subject is stable, though integration of consciousness has resulted in a dual identity conflict. He dictated to the recorder, his voice calm and clinical. Cognitive dissonance is extreme. Further observation is required. As the screaming on the table continued, he began to take his notes. A meticulous god, documenting the intricate details of the private, eternal hell he had just so brilliantly created. Chef Julian's Seraphim restaurant, Elysium, was not merely a place to eat. It was a temple of gastronomy, where he served as high priest. Each dish was a prayer, each ingredient a sacred text. For a brief, shining year, it held 3 Michelin stars, a testament to Julian's obsessive genius. Then came Arthur Pemberton, a food critic whose pen was a scalpel, dissecting restaurants with a cold, surgical disdain. His review of Elysium was not merely negative, it was evisceration, Seraphin. But he did not forget Arthur Pemberton. 5 years later, a single black envelope, sealed with crimson wax, arrived at Pemberton's desk. It contained a heavy card, inviting him to a private, one-night-only revival of Elysium. The location was a secret. A car would be sent. The invitation promised a 7-course meal that would redefine the very essence of sacrifice and flavor. Pemberton's lips curled into a smirk. The arrogance, the theatricality, it was so typical of him. He saw not a peace offering, but a desperate plea for relevance from a broken man. Intrigued by the audacity and confident in his own unassailable power, he accepted the invitation, eager to twist the knife one last time. The car, a vintage Rolls-Royce with blacked-out windows, drove him far from the city's glittering heart, into the industrial wasteland of the meatpacking district. It stopped before a derelict abattoir, a brick monolith from a forgotten age. But where there should have been decay, there was a strange, meticulous beauty. The entrance had been restored, and a single, warm light glowed from within. Julian Seraphin himself, looking gaunt, impossibly serene, greeted him at the door. He was dressed in pristine chef's whites, and he was the sole host, waiter, and cook for the evening. The grand dining room contained only one table, set for one guest. The first course arrived without a menu. It was a single, perfect oyster, resting on a bed of black sea salt. But the taste was unlike any oyster Pemberton had ever experienced. It was briny and sweet, yet carried a deep, resonant note of something else, something wild and almost metallic, like the taste of fear. "The ocean holds many secrets," Julian whispered, his voice a soft hum in the cavernous room. This creature lived its entire life in the shadow of a predator. That constant state of vigilance, that proximity to death, enriches the flesh in ways you cannot imagine. It is the taste of survival. The courses that followed were a symphony of culinary brilliance that bordered on the supernatural. There was a consommé that tasted of autumn fog and forgotten memories, and a carpaccio of some unknown red meat, so tender it dissolved on the tongue, leaving a lingering flavor of profound melancholy. With each dish, Julian would offer a quiet, philosophical monologue on its origin. He spoke of the importance of an animal's emotional state, of how a life of sorrow or rage could be rendered into a complex, challenging flavor profile. Pemberton, against his will, was captivated, his critic's mind struggling to categorize the genius he was tasting. He felt a strange, pleasant lethargy creeping over him, a warmth spreading from the exquisite wine that Julian kept pouring into his glass. The chef's presence was hypnotic, his quiet confidence a stark contrast to the broken man Pemberton had expected to find. This was not a plea for redemption, it was a declaration of absolute mastery. Pemberton began to feel a sliver of doubt, a tiny voice that wondered if perhaps, 5 years ago, he had been wrong. Perhaps he had been so blinded by his own power that he had failed to recognize a genius that operated on a plane far beyond his own understanding. Then came the main course. Julian presented it with a quiet reverence, placing the plate before Pemberton as if it were a holy relic. It was a roasted loin of meat, cooked to a perfect, blushing pink, served with a dark, glistening reduction sauce. Julian called it La Reprise du Critique, the critic's reprisal. The beast for this dish was a unique specimen. Julian began, his voice dropping to an intimate whisper. It was a creature of immense pride and arrogance. It fed on the failures of others, its flesh growing bitter and tough with its own bile. It required a very specific aging process to become palatable. Pemberton took a bite. The flavor was explosive, a complex tapestry of taste that was at once divine and deeply, fundamentally disturbing. It was the most incredible thing he had ever eaten. To tenderize such a creature, Julian continued, his eyes fixed on Pemberton's. One must first break its spirit. It was caged, forced to confront its own insignificance. It was fed a diet of its own words. its own venom, until the bitterness was purged for its very soul. Fear is the ultimate seasoning, Mr. Pemberton. A slow, creeping dread marinates the muscle from the inside out. A cold sweat beaded on Pemberton's brow. The details were becoming too specific, the allegory too sharp. He thought of another critic, a man named Alistair Finch, his predecessor, who had vanished without a trace nearly a decade ago. Finch had been a man of immense pride and arrogance, a man whose career had been built on the failures of others. The wine in his veins suddenly felt like ice. The delicious, tender meat in his mouth felt thick and heavy, like he could no longer swallow. He looked at the serene face of his host and saw not a chef, but an artist of absolute, unholy conviction. "You see," Julian said, a faint, triumphant smile gracing his lips. "A true artist must be willing to sacrifice everything for his craft." Alistair never understood that. He thought his words were the final judgment. He failed to realize that he was not the critic. He was merely an ingredient, waiting for a true master to unlock his potential. Pemberton tried to stand, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. The drug in the wine had taken hold. He could only sit and stare as Julian returned from the kitchen with the final course. It was a single, exquisite chocolate truffle, dusted with gold leaf and resting on a silver platter. "A palate cleanser," Julian said softly, "to prepare you for your new role in the culinary world." He gestured to a small, covered dish next to the truffle. "Every great dish needs a story, a provenance, and this one is deeply personal. I believe in using every part of the beast. Waste is a sin. After all." He lifted the cover. Resting on a bed of ice was a small, perfectly seared piece of human liver, a biopsy scar clearly visible on its surface. "From a living donor," Julian whispered. "It adds a certain vibrancy." Pemberton looked from the organ to the half-eaten truffle in his hand, and a wave of pure, unadulterated horror finally broke through the chemical fog in his brain. He had been dining on his own predecessor, and he had just consumed a part himself. He was not a guest at this feast. He was the livestock, being fattened and prepared for the next menu. His review had not destroyed Julian. It had merely provided him with a new, sustainable philosophy of sourcing ingredients. He had become the ultimate farm-to-table chef. The world began to fade into a dark, silent vignette around him. The last thing he saw was Julian's serene face, the face of a priest who had successfully completed a sacred ritual. The last thing he heard was the chef's soft, melodic voice. "Do not worry, Arthur. Your life's work is not over. It has simply entered a new, more refined stage. You will be my masterpiece, and I promise you, the critics will be ecstatic." Months later, a new, influential food blogger, renowned for her sharp, incisive critiques, receives a single black envelope sealed with crimson wax. The invitation is for a meal that promises to redefine the very essence of gastronomy. She arrives at a beautifully restored abattoir, where a serene, brilliant chef named Julian Seraphin greets her at the door. The first course is presented without a menu. It is a carpaccio of some unknown red meat. It's tender, it dissolves on the tongue, leaving a lingering flavor of profound and very familiar arrogance.